I had always wanted to camp in a place like this, completely alone, surrounded by nothing but nature. The Rocky Mountain National Park was the perfect spot. I'd done a fair bit of research, found a remote area by a small lake, miles away from any hiking trails. It was peaceful, just me, the mountains, the trees, and the water reflecting the sky. It felt like I had the whole world to myself. That first day, everything seemed perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, made a small fire, and spent the afternoon fishing and hiking around. The sky was a clear blue, the kind that stretches on forever, and the water was so still it looked like glass. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be there, completely disconnected from the noise and chaos of the world. That's the part of camping I love the most, the quiet, the simplicity. Out here, nothing feels rushed. No deadlines, no expectations, just time passing at its own pace. But as the sun started to set, the whole atmosphere began to shift. The shadows grew longer, creeping between the trees, and the forest seemed to change. It wasn't that anything was different exactly, but there was this subtle tension in the air. It felt like the landscape itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shrugged it off at first. Being out here alone, it's easy to let your mind play tricks. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush sounds louder, more ominous when you don't have anyone to share it with. After dinner, I sat by the fire, watching the stars. They were so bright, the kind you only get when you're far from the city. But that's when I first heard it, this faint noise coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, maybe a few animals scurrying around. But it wasn't like that. It was softer, almost like murmuring, like voices, just out of earshot. I stopped for a second, listening, but the fire crackled, masking the sound. I laughed at myself, shaking my head. It's nothing, I told myself. Probably just the forest settling in for the night. But that feeling, that sense that something was off, stuck with me. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth of it, but my eyes kept drifting back to the trees. They loomed around the campsite, taller now in the fading light, their shapes darker, less familiar. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The idea was ridiculous, of course. There wasn't anyone out here for miles. Just me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I crawled into my tent that night, telling myself I was being paranoid. It's just your imagination, Mason. You've camped alone before. I zipped up the tent and lay back on my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, trying to listen past my own thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, I could swear I heard that sound again, those whispers. Faint, distant, like they were coming from deep in the woods. I forced myself to sleep, but the unease stayed with me, like a presence just outside, waiting. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy. My sleep had been restless, broken up by strange dreams I couldn't quite remember. Something about being lost in the woods, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in around me. I shook it off and forced myself out of the tent. The crisp morning air helped a little, but there was still this nagging feeling that something was off. I chalked it up to spending too much time alone, letting my imagination run wild. That's the thing about camping by yourself. Your mind gets bored, starts to fill the quiet with nonsense. I tried to focus on the day ahead. I made some coffee, watched the mist rise off the lake, and planned a hike around the area. The beauty of the place was undeniable. The mountains towered in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow, and the forest stretched out like an endless sea of green. But even in the daylight, there was this strange weight in the air, like the forest was watching me. Every time I glanced toward the trees, I felt a flicker of unease, like something was just out of sight, lurking. As I hiked, I kept reminding myself that I'd chosen this isolation. I wanted to get away from people, from the constant noise and rush of everyday life. But the further I went into the woods, the harder it was to enjoy the solitude. The forest was too quiet. Not in the peaceful way I'd expected, but in a way that felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own boots on the dirt trail and my breathing, which seemed louder than it should have been. I stopped a few times to listen, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the trees, standing tall like silent sentinels. I came across that strange rock formation in the early afternoon. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I'd studied, and it definitely wasn't something nature had put there. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, like some kind of altar. My stomach turned as I got closer, not because the rocks were particularly creepy, but because it felt out of place. Too deliberate. I'd seen enough horror movies to know this was the part where the main character should turn around and leave. But instead, I took a closer look. That's when I noticed the carvings. The symbols etched into the stones were crude but unmistakably human. I couldn't tell what they meant, but there was something unsettling about them. The lines were rough, jagged, like whoever had made them was in a hurry, or maybe in a panic. I found myself tracing one of the symbols with my finger, the grooves cool and sharp beneath my touch. I don't know why, but I felt a chill run through me, like touching those carvings had somehow connected me to whoever or whatever had made them. Probably just kids messing around, I muttered, trying to laugh it off. But as I turned to head back to camp, that feeling returned, stronger this time. I wasn't alone out here. Something was watching. I could feel eyes on me, just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows where the light didn't reach. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was all in my head, but the hairs on the back of my neck stayed raised the whole way back. It wasn't until I reached the clearing by the lake that the feeling eased. I felt safe again, but it was a fragile kind of safety, like the forest was letting me catch my breath before it made its next move. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the lake. The light shimmered off the water, peaceful enough to almost make me forget about the strange rock formation. Almost. I kept glancing back at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the path remained empty. The woods looked calm again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a facade, like the forest was watching, waiting for something. I busied myself with small tasks to distract my mind, gathered more firewood, boiled some water, anything to keep my hands moving. I thought about leaving, packing up my gear and hiking out of there before nightfall, but I couldn't bring myself to admit that I was scared. "It's just a bunch of rocks," I muttered to myself, trying to sound convincing. I'd camped in remote places before, spent nights alone in the wilderness, but this felt different. This place didn't want me here. I could feel it in my bones, like the woods themselves were warning me. The sun finally set, and the fire crackled softly as I ate dinner. I kept the flames going strong, not wanting to sit in the dark for too long. I thought about those symbols again, the jagged lines etched into the stone. There had to be some explanation, something logical. Maybe kids had snuck out here, like I'd said before. Maybe some old hunters or locals had used the spot for some kind of ritual a long time ago. But why? And why did the place feel so wrong? The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around me, and I tried to ignore it, but then the sound started again. Those same soft murmurs from the night before, carried on the breeze, just loud enough to make me question if I was really hearing them. I froze, staring into the dark line of trees just beyond the glow of the fire. My pulse quickened as I listened, straining to make out the words, but they stayed just out of reach, like they were coming from a place I couldn't access. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the woods, the beam cutting through the darkness in sharp lines. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind, the branches creaking above me. But the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they were getting louder, clearer. My heart was racing now, and I stood up, trying to get a better look. "Who's out there?" My voice sounded strange, too small in the vastness of the night. There was no response, but the murmurs kept coming, almost rhythmic, like chanting. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The fire crackled and popped, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the edge of the forest. But there was nothing there. I was alone, or at least I should have been. The paranoia that had been creeping in all day was now in full bloom. Every sound, every shift in the trees felt deliberate, like something was moving just beyond my vision, always staying a step ahead. I stood there, frozen, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. The beam cut across the trees, but all I could see was the shifting shadows, flickering with the firelight behind me. The chanting, or whatever it was, kept coming. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest, too loud, too fast. Every instinct was telling me to pack up and leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I kept thinking, maybe it was just my mind playing tricks again. But how do you explain something like that? How do you reason with something you can't even see? I forced myself to sit down by the fire, like keeping it close would somehow make it all okay. I poked at the flames, watching the embers dance upward, trying to distract myself. But the sounds from the forest weren't going away. It was getting harder to ignore the fact that they were clearer now, less like wind, more like voices, human almost. My breath came faster, uneven. I was struggling to hold on to any logical explanation. Animals don't chant. The wind doesn't sound like people whispering in unison. What the hell is going on? I muttered to myself. I looked over at my tent, debating whether I should just grab my gear and start hiking back to the main trail, even if it was the middle of the night. It felt like the forest was pressing in, growing smaller, like it was closing me off. Every crackle of the fire started to feel like a countdown, like time was running out for something I couldn't see yet. I kept thinking back to the carvings on those stones. Those jagged, hurried lines. Were they a warning? A marker for something? I cursed myself for not taking a picture of them, something to study later. Not that it mattered. I didn't need to see them again to know they felt wrong. Everything here felt wrong. And the more I sat there, the more convinced I became that I wasn't just imagining it. Those sounds, the whispers, they were deliberate, like they were trying to get my attention. I got up again, pacing around the camp, shining my light into the woods. "Who's out there?" I called, louder this time. My voice bounced back at me, swallowed by the trees. No answer. But the whispers, they stopped, just like that. The silence felt sharp, almost oppressive, and I immediately regretted calling out. My pulse quickened, and for the first time since I got here, I felt real panic creeping in. Something had heard me. I could feel it. Something had heard me. I glanced around at the shadows again, scanning for any movement, but everything was still. Too still. The fire behind me seemed smaller now, like its warmth was barely keeping the dark at bay. My brain was screaming at me to get the hell out of there, but I hesitated. There was a part of me that didn't want to believe it was real, that wanted to stay, to prove to myself that this was just paranoia. But what if I was wrong? What if this wasn't just in my head? A branch snapped behind me, and I didn't even think. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and bolted toward the trail. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to stick around long enough to find out. I ran without looking back, not bothering to keep quiet. My feet pounded the dirt, and the beam from my flashlight bounced wildly ahead, lighting up branches and rocks just long enough for me to dodge them. The trail felt longer than I remembered, like it was stretching out before me, refusing to let me leave. Every time I thought I heard something, footsteps, whispers, movement in the trees, I pushed harder, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. The deeper into the woods I went, the more disoriented I became. The trail was fading, and the trees loomed closer, their trunks thick and gnarled, closing in from all sides. My heart was racing, a wild panic growing in my chest. I kept telling myself to focus, that the trail had to be here somewhere, but the darkness was swallowing everything. My mind raced with the possibilities. Was I being followed? Was it just paranoia driving me to the edge? I couldn't tell anymore. "Just keep moving," I whispered under my breath, almost like a mantra. "Just keep moving, you'll be fine." But I didn't believe it. Not really. I could still feel it, that presence, something unnatural just beyond the reach of my light. It wasn't a person, but it was there, and it was watching. I knew that much. Finally, I stumbled out of the trees into a small clearing, the cold air biting at my skin. For a brief moment, I thought I'd found my way out. But then I saw it, a familiar sight that froze me in place. That rock formation, the one with the carvings, the one I'd been trying to get away from. I stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. How the hell had I ended up back here? I had been running in the opposite direction for what felt like miles. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. The murmurs started again, soft at first, but growing louder, more distinct. The same rhythmic chanting, but now it felt like it was all around me. I could barely hear myself think over the sound of it. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shape, just barely visible in the faint moonlight, stepping out from the trees. My heart dropped. It wasn't a person, not really. The figure was too tall, too thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning through the dark. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I bolted again, sprinting through the trees, my mind screaming for me to get out. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I thought I'd gotten, the whispers were always there, just behind me, just ahead. I was trapped, and deep down, I knew it. Whatever I'd stumbled into, it wasn't going to let me leave. Not really. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out at some point because I woke up the next morning, lying on the side of a road. My gear was gone. My camp, the trail, even the rock formation, all of it was gone. I made it back to town eventually, but something stayed with me. It wasn't just the fear or the questions. It was the feeling that somewhere, out there in the woods, it was still waiting for me. I remember that winter break vividly. North Dakota isn't exactly the most exciting place, but my cousins made it bearable. The nights were always freezing, the kind of cold that bites into your bones. That night, we were hanging out at a friend's place, her basement filled with cheap beer and bad music. I wasn't really into it, just trying to keep my eyes open. It was past 3 a.m. and my body was begging for sleep. I think I'm gonna head home, I told my cousin. She was too distracted by whatever conversation she was having to care much. Be careful, was all she said without looking up. I shrugged, grabbing my coat and stepping outside. The cold hit me like a wall. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked. It wasn't far to their house, just a few hundred yards, straight through the woods. The sky was clear, the moon hanging low, bright enough to see where I was going without much effort. Still, the shadows stretched long across the snow, making everything look off. I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets and tried to focus on my footsteps, one after the other. I don't know when I first noticed him. My eyes had been locked on the ground, avoiding the glare of the snow. Then, there he was, out of the corner of my eye, maybe 75 yards away, walking in the opposite direction. I froze, the air catching in my throat. He must have noticed me at the same time because he jerked his shoulders slightly, like I'd startled him too. For a second, we both just stood there, staring. My first reaction was to laugh, an awkward, nervous kind of thing. I gave him a small wave, like I was saying, "Sorry, you scared me." But he didn't move. He didn't wave back, just stood there, staring. That ski mask made it worse, covering his entire face except for his eyes, which I couldn't make out from that distance. He was tall, taller than me for sure, and stocky under his jacket. Something was wrong. I don't know what it was, but it hit me then. The way he stood there, watching me, not saying anything, not even acknowledging my wave. Every muscle in my body told me to walk, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I stood there, locked in place, my breath hanging in the cold air. It felt like everything around me stopped, just me and him, alone in the snow. He didn't move. I wanted to tell myself he was just some guy, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone out late like I was. But the way he stood there, stiff and unmoving, sent a surge of dread through me. I gave a small, nervous cough, like I was trying to break the tension between us, hoping he'd shrug it off and keep walking. But nothing. He didn't turn away, didn't even flinch. His eyes, or at least where I thought his eyes were behind the mask, stayed locked on me. The moonlight reflected off the snow, casting long shadows between us. But the longer I looked, the more the shadows seemed to move, to shift. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. "You all right?" No answer, just his outline against the snowy landscape. The wind picked up a bit, biting against my face, but I couldn't focus on anything except him. Something was wrong. My stomach tightened, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for him to respond, waiting for anything. My mind started racing, thinking of every horror movie cliché I'd ever seen. Alone in the woods, a masked figure, no one around. It was like some twisted joke the universe was playing on me. I tried to reason with myself. He's probably just lost. Maybe he's cold and freaked out, same as you. But the way he just stood there, unmoving, was messing with my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for me to do something, to make the first move. "Okay, well, I'm just gonna go," I said, my voice trembling now. I took a step back, the snow crunching under my boots. My eyes stayed on him, waiting for him to move, to say something, but he didn't. Not a single step, just watching. Panic surged in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, louder than the wind around us. "Go," I told myself. "Just go." I finally forced myself to turn around, my legs moving on their own. As I started walking, the sound of my footsteps seemed deafening, each one louder than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right behind me, closing the gap between us, following my every step. The distance between my cousin's house and where I was suddenly felt impossibly far. I didn't want to look back, but the fear gnawed at me, telling me I had to. I could feel the snow starting to seep into my shoes as I walked, each step a little faster than the last. The cold was biting, but it wasn't what had me panicking. It was the thought of him, just standing there, staring. It felt wrong. There's something about someone not moving when they should that messes with your head. The whole thing felt like it was on a loop in my mind. Me standing there, him staring back, not a word between us. I tried to convince myself it was just some weird misunderstanding. Maybe he was drunk. Or maybe he thought I was the one acting strange, walking around in the middle of the night. But that didn't explain the mask, or why he hadn't said a single word. That wasn't normal. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him trailing me, but each time I looked, nothing. Still, the idea of his face, well, that mask, stuck in my brain like a splinter. I wasn't far from my cousin's house now. Just a little further. The snow was crunching under my feet, and my breath was coming out in harsh, visible puffs. I tried to focus on the sound of my own steps, anything to drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. Maybe he's still standing there, I thought. Maybe he's watching me leave, planning something. No, just keep going. The night felt endless, like time had slowed down. The moonlight made everything seem strange, unfamiliar. Even the trees looked twisted, their branches reaching out like they were trying to grab me. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the rising panic. My legs felt heavy, like I was dragging them through quicksand instead of snow. Finally, I saw the faint outline of my cousin's house in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. The thought struck me like a hammer. What if he's following me, but keeping his distance? What if he's watching me right now, just out of sight? My throat tightened. I felt the urge to run, but I didn't want to look like a fool if anyone saw me. Still, something told me to check one more time, just one last look before I got inside. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding, and there he was, far off in the distance, but definitely closer than before. He was moving now, slowly, deliberately, walking in the same direction I had been. Toward me. I froze. My heart raced as I squinted into the dark, trying to make out any details. The figure, barely visible against the snow, was definitely moving, heading in my direction. My pulse quickened, my breath coming faster as panic gripped me. Was he following me? Or was it just a coincidence? Every step I took toward the house seemed to be matched by his steps. The distance between us narrowed, and I could see him more clearly now. He was tall, his features hidden by the mask, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. Deliberate, almost methodical. It felt like he was tracking my progress, as if he had all the time in the world. I wanted to scream, to run straight to the house, but I couldn't let him see me panicking. I tried to calm myself, forcing my legs to keep moving, my steps quick but not frantic. I could almost feel his eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if he had a weapon? What if he was planning to corner me? The cold seemed to seep deeper into my bones as I imagined these dark possibilities. The house was getting closer, but so was he. The path I was on twisted and turned, making me feel exposed and vulnerable. I looked back again, and now he was much closer, maybe only 50 yards away. His pace was steady, not speeding up, but not slowing down either. Each time I glanced back, the space between us grew smaller, like a predator stalking its prey. As I approached the house, I noticed something strange. The lights were off. Normally, there would be a warm glow from the windows, but now it was dark, foreboding. I began to dread the thought of reaching the front door, finding it locked, or worse, not finding anyone home. My mind raced with every possible outcome, each one more terrifying than the last. Just as I reached the driveway, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, ready to face whatever was coming, but instead, it was my cousin's friend, her eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, noticing the fear in my face. I turned to point at the path, but the figure was gone. It was as if he had melted into the night. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled inside, the door closing behind me with a thud. Safe for now, but the memory of those final moments in the snow would stay with me, haunting me with the question, had he really disappeared, or was he still out there, watching? I thought I was safe once I got inside the house, but the tension didn't leave me. I paced the living room, the shadows cast by the dim lamp making every corner seem menacing. My cousin's friend, Sarah, watched me with growing concern. I tried to calm my racing heart as I recounted what happened. "I saw someone out there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He was following me." Sarah frowned, looking out the window as if she could see through the snow and darkness. "There's no one out there now," she said softly. "Maybe it was just someone out for a walk." Her words sounded reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I'd been so sure he was following me that I had even felt the chill of fear as if it was an actual presence. Sarah tried to convince me to stay, but my mind was set. I couldn't stay here, not with the image of that figure burned into my memory. I gathered my things quickly, hoping that leaving might somehow make me feel less exposed. As I pulled on my coat and scarf, I glanced out the window once more. The snow had started again, falling heavily and erasing any traces of footprints. "I'll be fine," I said, more to myself than to Sarah. "I just need to get some fresh air." I stepped out into the snow, the cold biting at my face and hands. The path back to my cousin's house was now a white blur, the world reduced to an endless expanse of snow and darkness. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the shadows. My footsteps crunched loudly in the quiet, a constant reminder of how alone I felt. The snow was falling heavier now, making the path slippery and treacherous. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. Just as I was approaching the house, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Sarah. "Hey, I just realized something. The guy you saw, we don't have any tall friends. All our friends are average height. Just wanted to let you know." I stopped dead in my tracks. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just that the figure was tall. It was that he didn't fit into any category of people I knew. Suddenly, it wasn't just about a stranger. It was about someone who didn't belong, someone who wasn't supposed to be there at all. I turned around and sprinted back to Sarah's house, my mind racing. The cold seemed to numb everything else but the fear. By the time I reached the door, I was out of breath and shaking. Sarah let me in with a worried look, and as I slammed the door behind me, I couldn't help but feel that the worst was yet to come. That figure wasn't just a random stranger. He was a part of something I couldn't yet understand, something that might still be watching, waiting. The cabin was as remote as it gets, miles of dirt roads and wilderness before you even got a glimpse of the place. My dad had inherited the property from an old family friend, and no one had really touched it in years. It was just this old wooden structure tucked into the Idaho wilderness, surrounded by thick trees, no cell service, no electricity. I figured it would be a good spot for a weekend of just disconnecting, hanging out with my buddy, and getting away from everything. We'd been there for a couple of days already, settling into the slow pace of doing nothing. We spent the day fishing at a nearby stream, grilled up what we caught over the fire, and now we were just lying on our bunks, laughing and telling stories. The only light in the cabin came from the lantern between us, casting these long shadows on the old wooden walls. Outside, you couldn't hear much, just the occasional rustling of leaves, the wind moving through the trees. It was peaceful, isolated, exactly what I needed. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. My friend clicked off the lantern, and the cabin went completely dark. I laid there for a bit, letting the quiet settle in, my eyes adjusting to the pitch black. We kept talking, the kind of half-asleep conversation where neither of us was really listening to the other, just two voices filling the dark. That's when I heard it, a scraping sound, faint but definitely at the door. I sat up slightly, thinking I might have imagined it, but my friend asked, "Did you hear that?" We both laughed nervously. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself more than him. I lay back down, but my heart was pounding now and my ears were on high alert, waiting for another sound. A few minutes passed. Then, knock, 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 slow, deliberate, like someone was standing right outside, waiting. We both froze. No words this time. My friend and I just stared at the door, barely breathing. The knocks weren't loud, but they felt too out of place for where we were. This was the middle of nowhere. There shouldn't be anyone out here. I thought about grabbing the flashlight, maybe going to the door to check, but I couldn't move. Neither of us could. It was like we were both too afraid to make a sound, too afraid to even acknowledge what was happening. We just lay there, listening, waiting for whatever was on the other side to make another move. But after that last knock, nothing came, just the thick, suffocating quiet. We didn't say a word after that. My friend and I just stayed there, staring at the door, too scared to move. It was like we were waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. No more knocks, no footsteps, no voices, just that overwhelming quiet, like the world outside the cabin had stopped. I kept telling myself it had to be some kind of animal. Maybe a branch blew against the door, or a raccoon was messing around, but it didn't feel right. Animals don't knock like that. 3 perfectly spaced knocks, like someone was making sure we knew they were there. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the creeping anxiety that was wrapping itself around me. I felt my friend shift in his bunk, and I whispered, "What do you think that was?" He didn't answer right away. I could hear his breathing, heavy and uneven, as if he was trying to keep it together. "I don't know, man. Maybe we should check." That sounded like the last thing I wanted to do. I wasn't about to open that door. My brain kept cycling through possibilities, none of them good. What if someone was out there? A person? The nearest town was 50 miles away, and no one knew we were out here except my dad. There shouldn't be anyone in these woods, especially not at this hour. I tried to convince myself that we were just being paranoid. Maybe we'd heard wrong. But deep down, I knew. We hadn't imagined it. We lay there for what felt like hours, neither of us moving. My body was tense, and I was exhausted. But every time I started to drift off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard the knocking again. My eyes kept darting to the door, half expecting it to swing open any second. That was the worst part. Not knowing. Not knowing if someone was still out there, watching, waiting. Eventually, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, light was starting to creep in through the small window near the ceiling. The shadows in the cabin had softened, and the oppressive darkness had lifted. For a second, I let out a breath of relief. Morning. I could hear my friend stirring in the bunk across from me. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his voice low. "Barely," I muttered, sitting up and rubbing my face. I didn't feel rested at all, more like I'd been on edge for hours. "Do we check outside?" I didn't really want to, but we couldn't stay in the cabin forever. We got up slowly, as if moving too fast might set something off. My friend grabbed the flashlight, even though the sun was already making its way through the trees outside. I walked over to the door, pausing for a moment with my hand on the handle. My heart was thudding in my chest, every instinct telling me to leave it alone, but I turned the knob and opened it anyway. The door creaked, and for a second, we just stood there, looking out. The door creaked open, and cold morning air rushed into the cabin. My heart was still pounding, but the daylight gave me some sense of security. We both stepped outside slowly, our eyes scanning the ground around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place. The trees stood silent, the grass damp with early morning dew. My friend swept the flashlight across the ground, even though the sun was already filtering through the branches. I could feel the tension between us, both of us waiting for something to jump out, but everything looked just as it had the day before. I crouched down near the door, searching for any sign of what could have caused the noise. Footprints, tracks, anything. But the dirt was untouched. No scuff marks, no animal tracks, not even a sign of something brushing against the door. "Nothing," I muttered, my voice sounding distant, even to myself. I stood up and looked at my friend, who was still nervously shining the light around, his face tight with concern. "Maybe it was the wind or a branch," he offered, but it was half-hearted. We both knew the knocking had been too deliberate for that. We decided to circle the cabin, checking for anything unusual, but every step just deepened the confusion. There was no sign of anyone, no disturbances in the grass or dirt. I kept thinking back to the night before, the way the knocking had sounded, slow, rhythmic, too human. It wasn't something that could have happened by chance, and yet there was nothing here to prove otherwise. The lack of evidence didn't bring relief, though. It made everything worse. Who or what had knocked, and where did they go? My friend stopped by the back of the cabin and looked out into the woods. If it was someone, they're long gone by now. He said it like he wanted to believe it, like we could just laugh this off later as a creepy story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't in the clear. The cabin felt different now, less like a safe place and more like a trap, like something had been watching us the whole time, waiting for us to drop our guard. I glanced toward the tree line, half expecting to see movement, but there was only stillness. My chest tightened with a sudden paranoia. What if whoever it was hadn't left? What if they were still out there, hiding, waiting for us to go back inside? The thought twisted in my gut, and I realized how exposed we were. My skin prickled with a sensation I couldn't explain, like we were being observed. I wanted to say something, tell my friend that we should leave, but I couldn't get the words out. We finished the perimeter check in silence, both of us too uneasy to admit what we were really thinking. When we got back to the front door, I hesitated. Do we stay? My voice was flat, but the question hung heavy between us. My friend looked at me for a long moment, then shrugged. I don't know. Probably nothing, right? But his tone didn't match the words. Neither of us wanted to stay, but neither of us wanted to admit how scared we actually were. We ended up staying. Neither of us wanted to admit we were freaked out enough to leave, so we just went about the day like nothing had happened. I kept telling myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a tree branch did knock against the door, or maybe it was just some animal we didn't see. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it, the unease clung to me like a shadow. The cabin felt different now, like the walls were closing in on us. The day dragged on, and we kept ourselves busy, gathering firewood, checking the stream nearby, even taking a hike to clear our heads. But the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about the knocking. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind put me on edge. My friend was quieter than usual, too. He didn't say anything about it, but I could tell it was still bothering him. We were both just going through the motions, pretending that nothing was wrong, but the tension between us was palpable. By the time the sun started to dip below the trees, that familiar feeling of dread began creeping back in. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, like I expected to see someone standing at the edge of the woods. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. The stillness of the forest, the quiet that had once felt peaceful, now felt menacing. Like the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the night approached, I started to regret not leaving when we had the chance. The idea of spending another night in the cabin was making me uneasy, but I didn't want to be the one to suggest packing up. We had dinner, made a fire, and tried to act like it was just another night in the woods. But every flicker of the flames cast long shadows across the cabin walls, and I couldn't help but glance at the door every few minutes, waiting for that sound to return. My mind was racing, and the worst part was not knowing if we were safe or if something or someone was out there, waiting. At some point, we decided to call it a night. Neither of us wanted to linger outside for long, so we put out the fire and headed inside. The lantern flickered as we got ready for bed, and I could feel the tension building in my chest again. I climbed into my bunk, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that nothing was going to happen. But as soon as the lantern went out, the darkness swallowed the room, and the cabin felt small, and suffocating. We lay there in silence, both of us listening to the faint sounds outside. The wind rustling through the trees, the occasional creak of the old cabin walls. I kept waiting for the knocking, bracing myself for that slow, deliberate sound. But the hours dragged on, and nothing came. Just the thick, oppressive quiet, the kind that makes you question every little noise. My mind was racing, replaying the night before, wondering if we had just imagined it all. But deep down, I knew it wasn't in my head. Something had been there, and it wasn't gone. I woke up suddenly, though I couldn't pinpoint what had startled me. The cabin was pitch black, and for a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. I lay there, listening, but the only sound was my friend's slow, steady breathing from the other bunk. The room was still, nothing unusual, but my gut told me something was wrong. It felt like the air had thickened, the cabin somehow smaller than it had been when I'd fallen asleep. Then I heard it, a faint tap. Not a knock, but more like something brushing lightly against the door. My muscles tensed, and I instinctively held my breath, trying to make out if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. Another tap, then another, quiet but deliberate. I turned my head slowly toward the door, squinting through the dark, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to see anything from where I was lying. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat now, pounding against my ribs as I stared at the door, waiting for the next sound. My friend hadn't stirred, still deep in sleep, unaware of what was happening. The knocking, if you could call it that, was so subtle, like someone barely touching the wood, just enough to let me know they were there. It was worse than the night before, because this time I knew it was real. And worse than that, whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't trying to get in. They were just reminding me they hadn't left. My mind raced. Do I wake my friend? Do I get up and check the door? The last thing I wanted to do was open it, but we couldn't just lie there, pretending it wasn't happening. But before I could decide, the sound stopped, leaving me in complete suffocating stillness. I waited, straining to hear if there was any movement outside. Footsteps, rustling, anything. But there was nothing, no more taps, just dead silence. I don't know how long I lay there, eyes wide open, waiting for something to happen. But eventually, exhaustion crept back in, and despite my fear, I must have drifted off. When I woke again, pale light was filtering in through the cabin window. The knocking felt like a distant nightmare, but the dread I felt as soon as I opened my eyes was all too real. We got up, not saying much to each other, both of us eager to put the previous night behind us. But as we were packing our things, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The spare key. We'd always kept it hidden under a loose rock by the door in case my dad ever needed someone to check on the place. But when I reached down to grab it, the rock was pushed aside and the key was gone. I froze, staring at the empty spot, trying to make sense of it. "Hey," I called to my friend, my voice tight. "Did you move the key?" He walked over, confused, shaking his head. "No, why would I?" We both stood there for a moment, staring at the ground, the realization sinking in. Someone had been there. Someone had taken the key. I felt a cold wave wash over me. Whoever or whatever had knocked hadn't been trying to scare us off. They had been waiting, and now they had a way in. It was the last stretch of our 3-month camping trip through Northern California. I can still picture the dense woods, the endless roads winding into nowhere. We were just a few miles outside some tiny town that barely showed up on the map. It wasn't even dark yet, but we decided to set up camp anyway. There wasn't much daylight left, and none of us wanted to be fumbling with our gear in the dark. I remember the town had a gas station, a post office, and a rundown bar. That was it. The kind of place that seemed to exist just because nobody had bothered to tear it down yet. We didn't think much of it at the time, just shrugged it off as another quiet, sleepy stop in the middle of nowhere. But something about that place didn't sit right with me from the start. It was too still. I don't know how else to explain it, like everything was holding its breath. I brushed it off, though. I mean, we'd been camping for months. I was used to the isolation. But this felt different, more exposed. I think my friends felt it too, but none of us talked about it. Night fell fast. We had a fire going, nothing big, just enough to keep warm while we ate. It was quiet between us, each of us lost in our thoughts. That's when we first heard it, distant, muffled screams cutting through the stillness. At first, I thought maybe I imagined it, but then it came again. Not close, but not too far either. I could hear at least 3 voices, all tangled together, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I looked over at my friends and they were frozen too, straining to hear. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I kept my voice low. It wasn't like they could hear us. Jake nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, man, I heard it." For a few minutes we just sat there, listening. My mind was racing. Were they arguing? Were they in trouble? I couldn't tell. Then suddenly, a gunshot rang out, one single shot, and everything went quiet. I mean, dead quiet. No more voices, just nothing. I opened the flap of my tent, met the eyes of my friends across the campfire, and none of us spoke. What was there to say? We weren't going to go looking for trouble. Not here, not in a place like this. The night stretched on, but sleep didn't come easy. Every sound, every gust of wind, every creak of the trees made my heart race. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was none of our business. Whatever happened, it was over now, right? But that single shot kept playing in my head, over and over. Lying in my tent, I couldn't stop thinking about that gunshot. The air felt colder now, not from the temperature, but from something else. I tried to focus on the sound of the fire crackling, but it wasn't helping. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those voices out there, the moment they cut off after that single shot. What the hell had happened? Part of me wanted to get up, walk into town, and find out, but the smarter part of me knew better. We were outsiders here. This wasn't our problem, and getting involved could easily make it one. I rolled over, hoping the movement would somehow make sleep come easier, but instead, my mind kept racing. I could hear Jake shifting in his tent, probably feeling the same way. For all the trips we'd done, all the time we'd spent in the wilderness, nothing like this had ever happened. We'd been through storms, strange animal encounters, even some close calls with locals who didn't like campers on their land, but never anything like this. It felt like we'd stepped into something way bigger than us. The woods felt different now. It wasn't just the usual sounds of nature. There was this sense that something was watching us, like the trees themselves were hiding secrets. I told myself it was just nerves, that my imagination was running wild, but the feeling stuck. I wasn't alone in this either. Jake's quiet voice came from the tent next to me. "You think we should leave in the morning?" I didn't answer right away. The thought had crossed my mind, but leaving early would mean hitching a ride out of this place while still being in it. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to be on those roads, if whatever happened was still unfolding somewhere nearby. "Let's see how it feels at dawn," I finally said, though I wasn't sure if waiting was the right move. But what else could we do in the middle of the night? Hours passed, but I never really slept. Every little sound outside, leaves shifting, the distant hoot of an owl, pulled me back into full awareness. I kept thinking about those voices, the urgency, the fear in them before everything went quiet. What had they been trying to say? Who were they? My mind was doing laps, imagining all kinds of scenarios, none of them good. A fight gone wrong? An ambush? Something even worse? Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted off for a while. When I opened my eyes again, it was early morning, the kind of gray light that signals a new day but still feels like night is lingering. I sat up, my body stiff from the cold and the restless sleep. Jake and the others were already up, packing quietly. No one said a word about last night, but I could see it on their faces. They were as rattled as I was. I stepped out of my tent and scanned the tree line, half expecting to see something, someone watching us. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the early morning. We packed up in silence, and as we got ready to head back out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving something behind, something we weren't meant to see or hear. We packed up quickly, almost too quickly, like we were all just trying to get away from something. No one said it out loud, but I could feel the urgency in every movement. It wasn't just the cold morning air or the rough ground beneath our feet. It was that lingering sense from the night before, the tension that had seeped into our bones and refused to let go. As we hiked back toward the main road, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. but there was only the empty stretch of forest behind, trees standing still, pretending they hadn't witnessed anything. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. It was like my body was still bracing for something, like I was waiting for that gunshot to echo again, even though I knew it wouldn't. Jake walked ahead, his backpack hanging low, his head down. He didn't talk much, which wasn't like him. Normally, he'd be the one cracking jokes, making light of any situation, but today he was quiet. I wondered if he was thinking the same things I was, about what we'd heard, what we'd chosen to ignore. Part of me wanted to ask, but I didn't. It felt like acknowledging it would make it real, like saying it out loud would drag us back into that moment, and I wasn't ready for that. As we reached the edge of the woods, the small town came into view again, just like it had the night before. One long road, a gas station, a post office, and that bar. It didn't look any different, but somehow it felt off, like the entire place was hiding something just beneath the surface. The few people we saw moving around seemed to go about their day without a care in the world, as if nothing unusual had happened. But I couldn't shake the thought. Did they hear it too? Did they know? We stopped at the gas station, mostly to regroup and figure out our next move. While Jake filled up our water bottles, I wandered toward the road, staring down the stretch of asphalt that disappeared into the horizon. That gunshot played over and over in my mind, and I kept picturing those voices, how they had cut off so suddenly. What if someone had needed help? What if we could have done something? But then again, we were just passing through, kids with no real idea of how things worked out here. "Hey," Jake called from behind me, his voice low. I turned, and he motioned toward the bar. "We should check it out, see if anyone's talking about last night." I didn't like the idea, but I nodded anyway. Maybe part of me wanted answers, or maybe I just didn't want to leave without knowing what we were running from. As we approached the door, a wave of unease washed over me. The place was dark, even in the middle of the day, and the people inside seemed off. There was a weight in the air, not something you could see, but something you could feel, like the whole town was in on some secret that we weren't meant to know. We stepped inside, and immediately the bartender glanced up, his eyes sharp and knowing. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at us made my skin crawl. Something wasn't right here, and I had the sinking feeling we were about to find out what it was. As Jake and I walked into the bar, the low hum of conversation seemed to drop a notch. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. It was dim, illuminated only by a few flickering neon signs and the soft glow of a jukebox in the corner. The patrons scattered throughout the room were hunched over their drinks, their eyes avoiding ours. I felt the bartender's gaze as soon as we entered. He stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with a rag that looked like it hadn't been changed in years. His eyes were cold and calculating, assessing us as if he could see right through our casual clothes and tired faces. Jake and I approached the bar, trying to look as nonchalant as possible. "Can we get 2 beers?" Jake asked, his voice steady but his eyes scanning the room. The bartender nodded, still silent, and set to work. The clink of the bottle caps was the only sound in the room, punctuated by the occasional murmur from the other customers. While we waited, I noticed a group of men in the corner, huddled together. They weren't talking loudly, but their body language screamed tension. Every now and then, one of them would glance our way, only to quickly turn back to their conversation. I could feel their eyes on us, like we were somehow intruding on something. The bartender slid our beers across the counter, and I took a long swig, hoping it would calm my nerves. Jake leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's ask around, see if anyone's heard anything about last night." I nodded, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in my gut. We wandered over to a nearby table where a middle-aged man was nursing a drink, staring into his glass as if it held all the answers. Jake cleared his throat, trying to sound casual. "Hey, we were camping outside town last night and heard some strange stuff. You wouldn't happen to know what was going on, would you?" The man looked up slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, then he shrugged. "Don't know nothing about it. This town's quiet, always has been." His tone was dismissive, but there was a hint of something, fear maybe, in his eyes. I felt a cold sweat start to form at the back of my neck. It was clear that asking questions here was like poking a sleeping bear. We were on the edge of something dark, and no one was willing to shed any light on it. Jake tried a different approach, making small talk about the town's history, but the conversation was stilted. Each attempt to probe deeper was met with vague answers and sidelong glances. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath, like if we asked the wrong question, the floor might open up and swallow us whole. As we finished our drinks and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow seemed to be a sign that we weren't alone in our unease. The bartender's eyes followed us as we walked out, and I noticed that the conversation in the bar seemed to pick up again, almost as if we had been the center of a silent interrogation. Outside, the town looked the same, sleepy, isolated. But the atmosphere had changed. The shadows seemed darker, the air colder. As Jake and I walked back to our campsite, I couldn't shake the sense that we had stumbled into something that was better left alone. The thought of that gunshot still haunted me, and the eerie feeling that the town's secrets were closing in around us made me want to run, to get as far away as possible. But we were trapped, and we had to find a way out before whatever dark force was lurking here decided to make us its next target. We finally packed up and decided to leave the bar, the conversations and sideways glances still fresh in our minds. As Jake and I trudged back to our camp, the weight of the night felt heavier. The shadows seemed thicker, the forest around us more oppressive. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig felt like a reminder of how vulnerable we were out here. When we reached our campsite, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it had become. It was an unsettling silence, devoid of the usual nocturnal sounds of the forest. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me, reminding myself it was just the eerie atmosphere of the night playing tricks on my mind. Jake was busy with the campfire, trying to get it going again. His face was illuminated by the flickering flames, but the worry in his eyes was impossible to miss. "Something's off," he muttered, almost to himself. "I don't like this place." I nodded, trying to share his concern. "Yeah, it's like the whole town is hiding something. I just can't figure out what." The fire crackled and popped, but the warmth it provided did little to ease the tension between us. We settled into our sleeping bags, but sleep was elusive. Every sound outside the tent was amplified. Every shadow that danced in the firelight seemed to carry a hidden meaning. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that our every move was being observed by unseen eyes. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a muffled noise. It was a distant shout, indistinct but urgent. I turned to Jake, who was already awake, his eyes wide in the darkness. We exchanged a worried glance but said nothing. The fear was mutual and unspoken. We both knew that if we stayed silent, we might avoid drawing unwanted attention. The noise grew louder, unmistakably a call for help. It was followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Then silence. My heart raced and I could barely breathe. The tent's thin fabric felt like a flimsy barrier against whatever was out there. I wanted to call out, to do something, but fear rooted me in place. After what felt like an eternity, Jake whispered, "We have to check it out." His voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath his calm facade. We both knew it was a bad idea, but our curiosity and fear compelled us to investigate. We unzipped the tent carefully, the chill of the night air hitting us like a cold slap. With each step, the crunch of leaves underfoot sounded unnervingly loud. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved towards the source of the commotion. My flashlight swept across the trees, revealing nothing but dense foliage and shadows. As we reached a small clearing, I froze. There in the center lay a body. The sight was horrifying. A young man, his clothes torn and bloodied. A single gunshot wound was visible on his chest. It was clear he'd been dead for a while. Jake and I stared at each other, our faces pale. Did we stumble into something? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. His question hung in the air, unanswered. We were far from any help, and the knowledge that we might be the next victims gnawed at us. Then, out of the darkness, we heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. We both knew we had to leave, but fear had a grip on us that made movement almost impossible. The footsteps stopped, and a figure emerged from the darkness, partially hidden by the trees. It was the sheriff. His face was expressionless, and he looked us up and down with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. "What are you boys doing out here?" he asked, his tone almost too calm. We stammered through an explanation, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. The sheriff nodded, his gaze never leaving us. "You shouldn't be here. Get out of town and don't come back." We didn't need a second warning. We packed up as quickly as we could and left the campsite behind. As we drove away, I glanced back, feeling the weight of the sheriff's gaze on our backs. We had seen something we weren't supposed to see, and now we were left with a lingering fear that would stay with us long after we left those woods behind. It wasn't until we reached a safe distance that I allowed myself to breathe again. But the image of the body and the sheriff's warning would haunt me for years. We were lucky to escape with our lives, but the chilling realization that the town's darkness had been watching us the entire time stayed with me, a constant reminder of the danger lurking in the shadows. When I first moved to the area with my friend, we were both eager to explore. We'd heard about a promising hiking trail and decided to check it out. The day was already dark by the time we set out. It was the middle of winter, so the sun had dipped below the horizon by 4 in the afternoon. We drove down a dirt road that, according to our maps, should have led us to the trailhead. The road was narrow and twisted through dense woods, with the headlights piercing through the thickening darkness. Every shadow seemed to move. My friend, Mark, kept glancing at the map, while I peered out the window, hoping to spot any sign of the trail. The trees on either side of the road seemed to press closer with every mile we drove, making the atmosphere feel claustrophobic. We reached a dead end, and I could feel a chill run down my spine as the car came to a stop. There was no trailhead in sight, just a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. Mark turned the car around, and we began to head back. The gloom of the winter evening made everything feel more menacing. Halfway back, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as we got closer, the shape of a man became clearer. He was dressed in tattered clothes and covered in dirt, holding a shovel. His gaze was fixed on us, and something about his stillness was unnerving. Mark's hand tightened on the steering wheel, and I could see the same fear in his eyes that I felt. We didn't say a word, but the tension in the car was palpable. I stared straight ahead, willing us to drive faster. My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat forming on my palms. The man remained at the edge of the road, his presence haunting us as we drove away. When we finally made it back to town, we couldn't stop talking about what we'd seen. Both of us were shaken, but we kept questioning whether it was real. The darkness had played tricks on our minds, or so we hoped. We tried to brush it off as a strange encounter, but the image of that man with the shovel stayed with us, gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. The next few days were tense. Mark and I couldn't shake the image of that man standing in the dark. We joked about it to lighten the mood, but there was an undertone of unease in our voices. We kept bringing up that encounter, trying to make sense of it, but the more we talked, the more questions seemed to arise. We decided to revisit the area, hoping to find some explanation for what we had seen. It was a week later, and the daylight had begun to stretch out slightly, giving us a bit more visibility. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows as we made our way back down that same dirt road. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed that the man hadn't appeared in the daylight. The road looked different under the afternoon sun, less menacing, more like the forgotten path it was. We parked at the dead end and stepped out of the car. Mark and I walked along the edge where we'd seen the figure. There was no trace of him or any sign of recent activity. The dirt was undisturbed. The only sounds were the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional call of a distant bird. We moved back to the main road, both of us silent, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment. It was as if we were trying to force a sense of normalcy on an abnormal situation. As we were about to get back in the car, Mark turned to me and said, "You know, I keep thinking, what if it wasn't just a trick of the light? What if we saw something we weren't supposed to?" I nodded, unable to shake the thought that had plagued me since that night. Yeah, I keep wondering if we missed something. What was he doing there? Why was he just standing there with a shovel? We headed back to town, and the encounter stayed with us. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's vacant stare. Every rustling sound in the woods made my heart race. I couldn't help but think we were missing something we were too afraid to face. As we drove, the creeping sense of dread seemed to follow us, as if the shadows themselves were trying to reveal something we weren't meant to understand. When we got back, Mark and I parted ways with uneasy glances. I couldn't help but feel that our curiosity might have led us into something far darker than a simple scare. What if that night was more than just a chance encounter? What if there was a reason he was out there, waiting for us? The more I thought about it, the more the uneasy feeling grew, like a cold shadow clinging to my thoughts. A few days after our second visit, I found myself lying in bed, wide awake. Every small sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the man with the shovel, the way he stood motionless at the edge of the road. The questions just wouldn't stop. Why was he there? What was his purpose? The next morning, I decided to do some research. I started with local forums and online groups, trying to find any mention of odd events or people in that area. Nothing came up, which was almost more unsettling. It felt like the man had been a ghost, his presence a fleeting aberration that left no trace. I called Mark, hoping to share my findings and maybe calm my own nerves. "Hey, have you had any more thoughts about that night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not much. I've been thinking about it, though. I mean, the guy just vanished. It's like he was never there," Mark said. His voice was calm, but I could sense an edge of uncertainty. "It's driving me crazy, too. I don't know what to make of it." Our conversation didn't bring any comfort. Instead, it heightened my anxiety. Mark and I had been friends for years, and we had shared plenty of strange experiences. This one, though, felt different, more personal, more invasive. Determined to find some closure, I decided to go back one more time. It was early afternoon, and the sun was high. I drove alone this time, hoping the daylight might bring some clarity. I parked at the dead end and walked down the road, scanning the surroundings. The area seemed normal, a few scattered trees, overgrown grass, and the familiar path we'd taken before. There was no sign of the man, no indication that anything was out of place. As I was about to head back, a sudden movement caught my eye. I looked up and saw a figure in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. My heart jumped. The figure was too far away to make out details, but it reminded me of the man with the shovel. I squinted, trying to see clearly, but the figure didn't move. The rest of the drive back was nerve-wracking. I felt an unease that was hard to describe, a nagging feeling that something was off. I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. I knew it was irrational to feel this way. After all, it could have been anyone out there, maybe just another hiker or a local. But the way it seemed to linger, the way it felt like it was watching me, made me question my own sanity. That night, sleep eluded me again. I lay in bed, my thoughts racing. The more I tried to rationalize the encounter, the more my mind wandered into darker possibilities. What if the man was something more than just a strange individual? What if there was something about that place that we didn't understand, something that went beyond mere chance? A week had passed since my second visit, and I was still haunted by the image of the man. My nights were restless. I could barely focus on work, and my mind drifted to that narrow dirt road at every opportunity. It was consuming me. One afternoon, I decided to check out the local library, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the eerie encounter. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, directed me to a section about local history. As I flipped through old newspapers and historical records, nothing unusual stood out. That is, until I stumbled upon a faded article about a young man who had gone missing decades ago. The article was brief and lacked detail, but the date caught my eye. It was from the exact time frame we were in the area. My pulse quickened as I scanned the lines. The article mentioned a search that had turned up nothing, and the case had gone cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection, so I decided to dig deeper. I spoke to a few locals who had been around for years, They remembered the missing person case, but didn't have much information beyond what was in the article. One elderly man, though, hesitated before speaking. "People around here still talk about strange things happening on that road," he said, his voice low. "Some folks think it's cursed, or that it's somehow tied to the missing man." His words made my skin crawl. I thanked him and left, feeling a growing sense of dread. I needed to go back and see if there was something I had missed. That evening, I drove back to the road with a flashlight and a camera. The chill in the air was biting, and the dark felt even more oppressive now that I knew about the missing person. I parked at the same dead end and started walking, scanning the ground for any signs that might explain the man's presence. As I approached the spot where we'd seen him, I noticed something different. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, large, heavy prints leading off the road and into the woods. I followed them, my footsteps barely making a sound. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and every rustle of leaves felt magnified. I felt a deep, unsettling sensation that I was not alone. The tracks led to a small clearing where I found an old, weathered shovel half buried in the ground. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same kind of shovel the man had been carrying. I took a few pictures, but my hands were trembling so much that most of the shots were blurry. A distant sound made me freeze, a faint, rhythmic thud like something heavy being struck repeatedly. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound seemed too deliberate, too intentional. I stood still, straining to hear, and then I saw it, a shadowy figure moving between the trees. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back to the car. My heart was racing as I sped away from the road, unable to shake the image of the figure from my mind. I felt like I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and now I was left with more questions than answers. What had I stumbled upon? And who, or what, was still out there? The next day, my mind was still reeling from the night before. I couldn't shake the image of the shovel or the shadowy figure I'd seen. I felt compelled to tell someone, so I went to the local police station, hoping they might shed some light on the matter. A deputy named Thompson listened to my story with a skeptical but polite demeanor. "You've been out there alone? At night?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, feeling the weight of his doubt. "Well, it's a pretty desolate area. People see all sorts of things when they're alone in the dark," he said. His tone was dismissive, but something in his eyes made me think he knew more than he was letting on. Undeterred, I decided to visit the area one more time. This time, I brought my friend Mark along, hoping his presence might help me feel less on edge. As we drove down the dirt road again, I pointed out the clearing where I'd found the shovel. Mark was visibly uneasy, but he trusted me enough to follow along. We walked through the woods, retracing my steps from the previous night. The tracks were still there, faint but noticeable. The shovel lay where I had left it, now partially covered by fallen leaves. We inspected the area more thoroughly, and that's when Mark spotted something that made my blood run cold, a small, partially buried metal box, barely visible under the dirt. Mark pried open the box with his flashlight. Inside, we found old, yellowed photographs and documents. The photos were of a man who looked remarkably similar to the one I had seen. There were also handwritten notes about local disappearances and strange happenings. One note was particularly chilling. "The road knows what it has taken. It waits for those who seek." A sense of dread washed over me. What had I uncovered? The notes were dated back to the time of the missing person case I had read about. My heart raced as I considered the implications. I turned to Mark, my voice barely a whisper. "I think we've stumbled onto something that someone doesn't want us to find." As we made our way back to the car, I felt like we were being watched. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. When we finally reached the car, I glanced back at the woods, my mind racing. It was then that I saw him, the man in tattered clothes, standing at the edge of the clearing, holding the same shovel. He was staring directly at us, his face partially obscured by the shadows. I grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him into the car. We sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror to see the man slowly fading into the darkness. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what had happened. Had he been following us all along, or had he somehow been there, waiting? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of something much more sinister. The photographs and notes suggested a pattern of disappearances and a malevolent force tied to the road. And now I was part of that pattern. What had seemed like a simple encounter had turned into a dark puzzle with pieces that didn't fit. As I stared at the ceiling, I wondered what lay in the depths of that road and what had driven the man to watch us so intently. The fear that I had initially felt was nothing compared to the terror of not knowing what might come next. The road, it seemed, had its own secrets, and I was now entangled in its web. It was just another day out in the woods, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The sun was barely cutting through the thick canopy of trees as we hiked deeper into the backwoods of Tennessee. I was there to train Case, the new girl on the team, on how to document livable structures for the census. She was all energy and enthusiasm, practically bouncing with every step. I wasn't. I've done this job long enough to know when something feels off, and something about these woods didn't sit right with me. The air felt wrong the moment we crossed into that stretch of dense forest. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like the trees were closing in, and the paths, if you could even call them that, got narrower. Every now and then, Case would break the silence with some comment about the cool, abandoned structures we'd seen earlier. Old schools from the early 1900s, a few decrepit cabins with moss growing over them, like nature had decided to take back what was hers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another quiet day in the woods. There was something different about this place. We were about 4 miles in when we spotted it. A shack, barely visible through the thick brush. It looked like it had been built with whatever scraps someone could find, pieced together in a hurry. Smoke was rising from behind it, thin, steady, the kind of smoke you'd expect from a fire burning for a while. There was no sound, but I knew immediately that someone was close, too close. Then I saw it, the shotgun, leaned casually against a tree like it was waiting for someone. A ragged coat hung beside it, swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. My heart sank, and my pulse quickened. "Isn't this exciting?" Case whispered, her eyes wide with curiosity. I wanted to snap at her. This wasn't exciting. It was dangerous. She didn't get it. Probably thought we were about to uncover some quirky little moment we could laugh about later. But that coat, the gun, and the fire said otherwise. Whoever lived here wasn't someone we wanted to meet. I didn't care if we had the government's permission or badges. People out here didn't take kindly to strangers, and they certainly didn't like people poking around their homes. I forced a smile, but inside, my gut was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. "Case, let's go. We've seen enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to spook her, but more importantly, I didn't want to spook whoever was watching us. Because someone was watching us. I could feel it. Every crunch of the leaves underfoot seemed to echo, and every rustle in the underbrush sounded like someone creeping up behind us. I didn't know if it was paranoia or instinct, but I wasn't about to find out the hard way. We turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. A twig snapping in the distance. Not close enough to be immediate danger, but not far enough to ignore. I shot Case a look, and she finally seemed to understand. Her smile faded, replaced by something closer to fear. I couldn't tell if we were being followed or if we just stumbled into someone's territory at the wrong time, but either way, we were too far from help. The car was miles away, and cell service out here was laughable at best. It was just us, the trees, and whoever was out there. My mind raced, thinking of all the stories I'd heard, moonshiners, squatters, people who lived so deep in the woods they didn't want to be found. I'd heard about census workers disappearing in places like this, but I always thought it was just stories people told to scare newbies. Now, it didn't feel like a story. It felt real, too real. I grabbed Case's arm, a little harder than I meant to, and started walking back the way we came. I didn't care if it seemed rude. My nerves were shot, and the faster we got out of there, the better. She was quiet now, finally picking up on the seriousness of the situation. I kept my eyes on the ground, following the faint trail that led us there, but it was hard to focus. My thoughts were racing, every possible scenario flashing through my mind. What if that guy had seen us already? What if he didn't like the idea of a couple of strangers near his shack? The woods felt different now, darker somehow. The trees, once just part of the scenery, seemed taller, thicker, almost suffocating. The light had shifted too, casting long shadows that moved with every breeze. And the quiet, damn, it was loud. I could hear everything, the snap of branches under our boots, the rustling leaves, the distant call of a bird. But every time I heard something that wasn't us, my heart skipped. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but it was getting harder. I wanted to say something to Case, crack a joke to lighten the mood, but nothing came out. "Do you think we're being followed?" Case asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was, but lying didn't seem right either. "I don't know," I said finally, keeping my voice low. "Let's just keep moving." The trail seemed longer than before, like the woods were stretching around us, slowing us down. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, a shadow, a figure, anything, but there was nothing. Just trees. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like something was lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. Not close enough to see, but close enough to feel. The tension was gnawing at me, a knot tightening in my chest. Case started to speak again, but I cut her off. "Not now," I said, harsher than I meant. "We need to focus on getting back." I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to doubt if we even could. The woods had a way of twisting paths, making you second-guess which way you came. I glanced at the sky through the branches, trying to get a sense of direction, but everything looked the same. A sudden rustle to our right made me freeze. I threw out my arm to stop Case, my heart hammering in my chest. For a second, everything was still. Then, slowly, something moved in the brush. A figure, low to the ground, barely visible. I held my breath, waiting, watching. Was it a deer? A raccoon? It didn't matter. I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I motioned for Case to follow, and we started moving again, faster this time. My legs felt heavy, like I was trudging through mud, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Every instinct I had was screaming that we weren't alone, that something or someone was out there, watching, waiting. I wanted to run, but I knew that would be a mistake. Whoever was out here knew these woods better than us. Running would only make us more vulnerable. As we neared what I hoped was the edge of the woods, I could feel the muscles in my shoulders unclenching, just slightly. Maybe we'd make it out of here without incident. Maybe the worst part of this day would be a bad scare and a few extra miles on foot. But just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard it again. Another crack, closer this time. That crack sent a jolt through me. I froze again, eyes darting to the trees. This time there was no mistaking it. Something was out there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. My pulse quickened, a dull throb in my ears. Every instinct told me to pick up the pace, but I couldn't. I was stuck, glued to the spot, scanning the tree line like a trapped animal. Case's voice broke the spell. "Mike, what are we doing?" "Let's go," she hissed, panic creeping into her tone. I could hear the fear now. Her earlier bravado was long gone. She wasn't some curious rookie anymore. She understood the danger. I nodded, more to myself than her, and forced my legs to move. One step, then another, until we were moving at a brisk walk. The woods felt endless. Every tree looked the same. Every path seemed to loop back on itself. The more we walked, the more it felt like we were going in circles. I wasn't even sure if we were heading in the right direction anymore. The forest had swallowed us whole, and I wasn't sure it was going to spit us back out. Another crack. Closer. Too close. My body reacted before my brain did, turning sharply to the right, away from the noise, pulling Case along with me. We stumbled off the trail, pushing through thick brush that scratched at our legs and arms. I didn't care about the pain, didn't care about the branches catching in my clothes. All I cared about was putting distance between us and whatever was behind us. "Mike, where are we going?" Case's voice was shaky, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She was starting to panic, and I couldn't blame her. My own breathing was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest like it was about to burst. But I couldn't let her see that. I had to keep it together, had to get us out. "I don't know," I admitted, glancing back over my shoulder. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone following us. But that didn't mean we were alone. "Just keep moving." We stumbled through the undergrowth, moving as fast as we could without breaking into a full-out sprint. The woods were thicker here, branches hanging low, slapping against our faces. It was harder to see, harder to breathe. My mind was racing. How long had we been walking? Were we even close to getting out? Or were we just digging ourselves deeper into the forest? Then I heard it. A low, steady sound, almost like breathing. I stopped, my blood turning cold. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Case had stopped too, her eyes wide, fixed on me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely audible. I nodded. My eyes flicked to the trees again, but I didn't see anything. That didn't mean it wasn't there. I stood there, frozen, listening to that strange, steady sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, like something, or someone, was trying to make sure we knew it was there. My hands were shaking. I didn't want to let Case see, but there was no hiding it anymore. I wasn't in control. I didn't have the answers. I couldn't even tell her we'd be okay, because deep down, I didn't believe it myself. Case looked at me, her face pale, waiting for me to say something, anything, that would make this make sense. I couldn't. So instead, I nodded toward a patch of trees thicker than the rest. "This way," I muttered, even though I had no clue if it was the right direction. It just felt like we needed to move, to keep putting distance between us and that sound. We pushed through the brush again, the twigs snapping under our feet. Everything seemed to blur into one endless stretch of green and brown. I was running on instinct, nothing more. Case followed close behind, her breath loud in my ear. I knew she was scared. Hell, I was scared, but the last thing I needed was for her to panic completely. I couldn't let that happen. I had to keep it together, for both of us. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the air felt thicker. Not heavy or suffocating, just full. It was like everything around us was watching, waiting. Every sound felt closer, like the forest itself was alive, shifting and closing in. My senses were on overload. Every snap, every rustle of a leaf felt like someone was right behind us. I glanced over my shoulder more times than I could count, each time expecting to see a figure, a shadow, something that would finally make sense of this creeping dread. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "Mike, we can't just keep running like this," Case said, her voice shaky but trying to stay calm. "We don't even know where we are anymore." She was right. We were lost. But I didn't have the guts to admit it. Instead, I swallowed hard and kept moving. "We're close," I lied, trying to convince myself as much as her. "We just need to find the trail again." But deep down, I knew we were in trouble. My sense of direction had completely failed. We could be walking in circles for all I knew. The ground beneath us sloped downward, and the trees grew even denser. The sound, the breathing, or whatever it was, faded behind us, but that didn't make me feel any better. If anything, the sudden quiet made the hairs on my neck stand on end. We came to a small clearing, nothing more than a gap in the trees, really. The light barely made it through, but it was enough to let me catch my breath and look around. For the first time, I could see how far we'd gone. The shack, the road, civilization, it all felt so far away now. Too far. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself we could still find a way out, that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. Then a low voice broke the stillness, a voice I hadn't expected to hear. "Y'all lost?" I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a man. He was tall, scruffy, and leaning casually against a tree, like he'd been watching us for a while. The same man I'd hoped we wouldn't run into. My whole body went rigid when I saw him. He stood there, casual, like we were just two old friends catching up. His eyes, though, those didn't match his easy stance. They were cold, calculating, like he was sizing us up, figuring out what to do next. I didn't move. Neither did Case. We were both rooted to the spot, trapped by his gaze. I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts. "Yeah, we got turned around," I said, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. "We're with the census. Just doing our rounds, didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" He cut me off, his voice smooth, but with a hard edge underneath. He stepped forward, just a little, but enough to make my heart slam against my chest. He was blocking the only way out. I had to force myself to breathe. Case was silent, standing too still beside me. I could feel the tension radiating off her, like she was waiting for me to fix this, to say the right thing that would make this guy let us go. But I wasn't sure there was a right thing to say. Everything about this situation felt wrong. I kept replaying the last hour in my head, how we ended up here, how we ignored every instinct to turn back sooner. And now we were standing in front of this man who had clearly been expecting us, or someone like us. "You're a long way from where you're supposed to be, ain't you?" he said, his eyes never leaving mine. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That smile felt more like a warning than anything else. These woods, they don't take kindly to strangers. I tried to smile back, tried to act like we weren't terrified. We didn't mean to come this far, just looking to get back to the main road. He nodded slowly, as if he was considering it. "Yeah, I'm sure you are." Then, without looking away, he pulled something from his back pocket, a worn, folded piece of paper. He held it out to me. "Take a look." My stomach twisted as I took it from his hand, unfolding it carefully. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a map, hand-drawn, rough, with the outlines of the surrounding woods. But then I saw it, the shack, and just below it, in small, jagged letters, "Census workers, 2 missing." I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked up at him, but he was already watching me, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Funny thing," he said, almost conversational. "You're not the first to come around these parts. Won't be the last either." Casey's breath hitched beside me, her eyes wide and locked on the map in my hand. It felt like the ground was slipping away beneath us. Everything around me blurred into a sharp, suffocating clarity. The forest, the quiet, his voice, everything closing in. "Now," he said, taking a step forward, "I reckon you've got 2 choices. You can keep walking, pretend you never saw that map, or..." He let the sentence hang, leaving just enough room for our imaginations to fill in the blanks. I knew what the other option was. I didn't need him to spell it out. I glanced at Case, her face pale and scared. She was waiting for me to decide, to lead. But in that moment, I realized there was no decision to make. We'd been trapped the moment we found that shack. It started like any other trip. I've hiked this trail in Pennsylvania more times than I can count, always alone, always enjoying the quiet isolation. The stretch near the cabin was usually empty. Nobody ever seemed to be there. And honestly, that's what I liked about it. The place felt like it had been abandoned for years, but the property was well kept enough that someone had to be maintaining it. I'd peer inside the windows every now and then, curious, but never saw anything that made me think someone actually lived there. It was just a cabin in the middle of nowhere. That one time, though, was different. I was about halfway through the trail when I spotted the guy. A big dude, standing outside the cabin, grilling, with cans of beer scattered at his feet like he'd been there all day. My first instinct was to just keep walking, but then he noticed me. Without missing a beat, he looked right at me and said, "Keep it moving, no food here." I wasn't even close to asking him for anything, but the comment felt like a warning, not a joke. There was something about the way he stared that stuck with me, even after I was long past his yard. I laughed it off at the time, told myself he was just some drunk local. But now, thinking back on it, I wish I'd paid more attention. It was the way he said it, like he didn't want me there. Not like most people you meet out here. Usually they wave, ask you how the trail is, maybe share a snack. This guy, he just wanted me gone. A year later, I decided to take my sister, my wife, and her friend on the same hike. It was familiar, and I figured it would be a good introduction for them to the trail I loved so much. I didn't even think about the cabin at first, not until we were coming up on it. And there he was again, the same guy, same setup, beer cans everywhere, grilling like before. It felt wrong seeing him again, like lightning striking twice in the same place. He noticed us right away, and for a second, I thought he'd give me the same "keep it moving" line. But then his eyes locked on the women. I don't know why, but my stomach tightened. His expression shifted, like he was suddenly way more interested in us than he should have been. He waved us over, offered dinner, said he had more than enough food. I tried to play it cool, thanked him, but said we were good, just passing through. But he kept insisting. "Come on, stay a while," he said, voice too friendly. His eyes lingered on the girls, and it made my skin crawl. I don't usually feel uneasy around strangers, but something about this guy just felt off. When he finally let us go, we kept moving, but I could hear him mumbling something as we walked away. I didn't catch what he said, and maybe it was better that way. We kept walking, but the further we went, the more I felt uneasy. The guy's offer to stay for dinner wasn't friendly. It was too much, too eager. The way his eyes had lingered on my wife and her friend, it had set off every alarm in my head. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the trail ahead, but my mind kept replaying that moment. His voice, the way it shifted from a casual invitation to something more insistent, it bothered me. The girls didn't seem to notice anything. They were talking, laughing, completely unaware of how tense I was. I didn't want to worry them, so I kept quiet, but I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that this guy knew where we were headed. He knew we'd be camping somewhere nearby. Every step we took felt heavier, like I was leading us closer to something dangerous, but I didn't say a word. When we reached the campsite, it was getting late. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The spot was nice, open enough to feel safe, but still surrounded by the thick woods. It should have been comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I set up the tent in silence, my back to the trail, keeping my ears open for any sign of movement. "Hey, you okay?" my wife asked, noticing how quiet I'd gotten. I glanced up, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired," I lied, trying to sound casual. But she knows me too well, and I could see the concern in her eyes. I didn't want to freak her out, but I also couldn't shake the image of that guy, his hands full of beer cans, his eyes on her. As night fell, the forest around us grew darker, swallowing the last bits of daylight. We sat around the campfire, but I couldn't enjoy it. Every rustle in the bushes, every creak of a tree branch made me tense. I kept imagining him, drunk, stumbling through the woods, finding our campsite. I'd seen his type before, the kind of guy who doesn't take no for an answer. The others eventually settled into their tents, their laughter fading into the night. But I stayed awake, listening, waiting. Something about tonight didn't feel right, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, hearing nothing but the slow breathing of everyone around me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that the guy was just some drunk fool. Maybe he was weird, sure, but lots of people out here keep to themselves. That's why they live in places like this. But my gut wouldn't let it go. I kept seeing him, standing by that grill, those beer cans scattered at his feet, and that look, like he was sizing us up. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, but the fire outside had burned down to embers. The warmth from earlier was gone, leaving the air cold, biting against my skin. The thought of sleep felt impossible. Every little crack, every shuffle of leaves made my heart race. I kept trying to tell myself it was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest. But then I heard it. A soft crunch of footsteps, deliberate, slow, moving closer. I held my breath, my body tensing up. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Maybe a raccoon or a deer passing through. But then I heard it again. This time, it was unmistakable. Human footsteps creeping closer, stopping just outside the tent. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Was it him? Had he followed us? I carefully turned my head towards my pack, where I had stashed the blowhorn earlier. It seemed so far away now, across the tent, and every move I made felt like it echoed in the stillness. My hand trembled as I reached for it, inch by inch, trying not to make any noise. I strained to listen, and I could hear a low mumble. It was him, the guy from the cabin. His voice slurred, like he was talking to himself, and my chest tightened. I could feel the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just some harmless encounter. He was right there, and I had no idea what he was planning. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to steady my breathing, trying to figure out what to do next. Run? Stay quiet? The horn seemed like my only option. The sound of something shifting outside broke my thoughts. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. I could hear him going through our stuff. I could hear zippers, the rustling of bags. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I slowly unzipped the tent, trying to make as little noise as possible. The cool air hit my face, and I fought the urge to shiver. Outside, the darkness felt almost solid, pressing in from all sides. I fumbled in the dark, searching for the blowhorn. My fingers brushed against its hard surface, and I gripped it tightly, the weight a small comfort. I could still hear him moving around, rummaging through our stuff. The sounds were muffled but unmistakable. My thoughts raced. What if he found something valuable? What if he was looking for something specific? And what if he didn't like us catching him in the act? I couldn't afford to think about that too much. I crept out of the tent, each step measured, trying to keep my movements smooth. I could see him now, just a shadowy figure, swaying slightly as he continued to go through our gear. He seemed oblivious to me, lost in his drunken state. I raised the blowhorn, aiming it carefully. This was my only shot to scare him off before things got worse. With a deep breath, I pressed the horn's button. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched blast that cut through the night. The guy's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. He let out a startled yelp, dropping what he was holding. His reaction was almost comical, but there was no time to dwell on that. I pressed the horn again, and the blast felt like it was shaking the ground. He stumbled back, tripping over the clutter. I watched him scramble away, his movements frantic. As he fled into the darkness, I could hear him mumbling something unintelligible, mixed with curses. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I turned back to the tent, where the others were now awake, their faces pale with fear. Everyone was scrambling to pack up. I could barely think straight, my mind racing with what had just happened. Why was he so intent on coming after us? What was he looking for? I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. We quickly gathered our things, our hands shaking as we worked. The earlier peaceful night seemed like a distant memory. We left the campsite in a hurried, almost panicked state, hiking quickly along the trail. The familiar path now felt like an escape route. The tension hadn't fully left me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the silhouette of the man reappearing. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, where the distant hum of traffic felt like a strange comfort. I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had changed something in me, something I wasn't ready to face just yet. After we finally made it back to the main road, I was grateful just to be in the vicinity of civilization. We drove in silence, everyone still shaken from the night's events. I couldn't help but replay the confrontation over and over in my mind, trying to piece together what had happened. The man's appearance, his behavior, it all felt so surreal. It was like we had walked into a scene from a movie, except it was all too real. The next day, once we had returned to our normal routines, I decided to check in with the local authorities. I needed to understand what exactly had gone wrong. I reached out to the ranger station closest to the trailhead, explaining our encounter in detail. The officer on the other end listened carefully, their tone neutral but attentive. "Actually, that cabin has been abandoned for years," the officer said. "No one should be living there. We don't have any record of recent activity at that location." I felt a chill run through me as I processed the news. How could someone be there if the cabin was abandoned? Had we imagined the whole thing? Or was there some other explanation? I pushed the thought aside, trying to focus on what I knew. I started asking around in the nearby towns, hoping to find someone who knew more about the cabin. To my surprise, everyone I spoke with gave the same answer. The place had been vacant for as long as anyone could remember. The locals were curious, but not particularly concerned. It seemed like the situation had slipped under their radar. The more I dug into it, the more unsettling it became. I kept questioning everything I'd seen and heard. Who was the man with the beer cans and the grill? Why was he there? And what had he intended to do if we hadn't scared him off? As I reviewed the details, the unsettling realization dawned on me. The man was not just an isolated oddity. He was a ghost, a figment of something much more disturbing. The feeling of dread didn't leave me. It lingered, growing heavier with each passing day. The question of who he really was and why he was there remains unanswered, a dark spot in a place that was supposed to be peaceful. The trail, once a sanctuary, now felt tainted, its solitude replaced by an eerie uncertainty. The encounter had left an indelible mark, and the unanswered questions only deepened the sense of unease. The desert had always been our playground, a place where we could let loose and forget about everything else. On weekends, My friends and I would head out there at night, riding our ATVs through the trails, our only company the distant stars and the occasional coyote call. It was during one of these nights that something strange happened. We had just stopped for a break near a jagged rock formation. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the heat of the day, and we were taking a moment to catch our breath. That's when a guy on a beat-up bike rode up to us, dust swirling around his tires. He seemed eager to join us and asked if he could tag along. We didn't see any reason to refuse, so we agreed. We continued riding, and I took my usual spot near the back, keeping an eye on our new addition. The trails were familiar to us, and we knew the terrain well. The guy seemed to be keeping up at first, but as we approached a hill that overlooks the desert, I glanced back and noticed he was no longer there. I thought maybe he had stopped for a moment, so I didn't think much of it at first. When we reached the top of the hill, I signaled for everyone to stop. I looked around, expecting to see him catching up. There was no sign of him or his bike. The darkness stretched out before us. The vast expanse of the desert was illuminated only by the stars. We called out, but the only response was our own voices bouncing back. I felt a growing sense of unease, an instinct that told me something was wrong. We split up, scouring the area for any sign of him. We searched for hours, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the blackness. Every time I thought I saw something, it turned out to be nothing more than a rock or a cactus. The absence of any trace began to gnaw at us. By 3 a.m., we were exhausted and frustrated. We had no choice but to head back to the meeting spot, our minds racing with questions. How could someone just disappear like that? The whole experience left a lasting impression on me. We never knew who the guy was or why he vanished so suddenly. There was a strange, unsettling quality to the night that lingered in my thoughts. We kept hoping for news about him, but as weeks passed, there was nothing. The desert, once a place of freedom and fun, had become a reminder of that eerie encounter and the mysteries that could be hidden in the vast, empty spaces we once took for granted. The days after that night were a blur. My friends and I tried to act like it was just another adventure gone wrong, but the absence of that guy was gnawing at me. We were all in the same boat, uneasy, questioning our own sanity. Every time we thought about it, the same questions circled. Who was he? Where did he go? Why did he disappear without a trace? El Paso had changed a lot since then, the once empty desert now filled with development. We were scared at the time, too scared to involve the authorities. Who were we supposed to tell? A stranger had joined us for a ride, vanished, and we didn't even know his name. How would we explain that? We hoped the news would report something, anything, but the weeks ticked by without a word. I found myself watching the local news obsessively, looking for any mention of a missing person or an accident. It wasn't just the disappearance that troubled me, it was the randomness of it all. This guy had rolled up on us out of nowhere. His sudden appearance and equally sudden vanishing act felt unsettling. It was like he had never been there at all, just a figment of a nightmare. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, I drove out to the desert again, wanting to retrace our steps. The moonlight was harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and shift. I parked near the same spot where we had taken our break and walked along the trail, hoping to find something that could explain what had happened. I called out, half expecting the guy to materialize out of the darkness, but the only response was the crunch of my boots on gravel. It was during this solitary search that I began to wonder if we had missed something. Could he have been involved in something sinister, perhaps a drug runner or something equally dangerous? The border town connection seemed more plausible now. The idea was horrifying. If he had been hiding from something or someone, it would explain why he vanished so completely. That night, as I lay in bed, the desert stretched out before me, and I couldn't escape the feeling of dread. The emptiness of the desert felt like it was closing in, the vast, open spaces now a reminder of the unknown. I hoped that if I went back to the desert again, I might find something to put my mind at ease. But deep down, I knew that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and the desert would forever hold its secrets, wrapped in shadows and silence. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. It was as if the desert itself was taunting me, its vastness a constant reminder of what we'd lost. One day, I decided to revisit the area where the guy had disappeared. Maybe I'd missed something, or perhaps seeing the place again would help me put the whole thing to rest. I arrived at dusk, just as the sun was setting. The light was fading fast, and the desert was turning a deep, dusky blue. I parked my truck and walked the trail we had taken that night. The desert was still, the only sound being the crunch of my boots on the gravel. I stopped frequently, scanning the area for any sign of what might have happened. I reached the spot where we had taken our break. It looked the same as it had that night, except now it felt emptier, more desolate. I tried to imagine what could have happened to the guy. Why had he vanished so completely? The thought of him getting lost or hurt seemed too mundane, too easy an answer. I began to wonder if there was something more sinister at play. "Hey man," I called out, half hoping he'd respond, but the only answer was the echo of my own voice. I felt foolish, talking to the empty desert, but the need for answers drove me. I began to notice how dark it had become, the shadows lengthening around me. I felt a growing sense of discomfort, as if I were being watched, though I knew that was irrational. As I walked further, I saw tire tracks in the sand. They weren't ours. They were fresh, too recent to be from the night we were out there. My heart raced. I followed the tracks, hoping they would lead me to something, anything, that would explain the guy's disappearance. The tracks twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the desert. Eventually, the tracks ended abruptly, vanishing into the barren landscape. I stood there, looking around, feeling a creeping sense of dread. It was as if the desert had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. I turned back, my mind racing with possibilities. The only thing I knew for sure was that I didn't want to be out there alone any longer. I hurried back to my truck, the darkness feeling heavier with each step. Back home, I replayed the evening in my mind, trying to piece together what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about those tire tracks and the feeling that something was watching me. The desert had always seemed so open, so freeing. Now, it felt like a trap. I hoped I'd never have to go back, but deep down, I knew the questions would never fully leave me. The thought of what might still be out there, hidden in the darkness, haunted me. Days turned into weeks, and the unease lingered like a stubborn stain I couldn't wash away. I found myself unable to focus on anything but that night, replaying the events over and over. I began questioning everything: the guy's sudden appearance, his disappearance, and the strange tire tracks. Every detail seemed to hold some hidden meaning I couldn't grasp. One night, while browsing through local news archives online, I stumbled upon a story about a man who had gone missing in the desert a few years back. The details were vague, but the name sounded familiar. I couldn't be sure if it was the same person, but the coincidence made me uneasy. I decided to visit the local sheriff's office to see if they could shed any light on the matter. When I walked into the station, the old sheriff, a grizzled man with deep lines etched into his face, greeted me. I explained what had happened that night, emphasizing how strange it was that someone could just vanish. The sheriff listened intently, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. "Missing persons in this area, especially around the border, can be complicated," he said, rubbing his chin. "Sometimes people vanish for reasons we don't understand. Drug runners, illegal crossings, these trails see a lot of activity." His words made me shiver, and I wondered if there was more to this than just a random disappearance. I left the station feeling no closer to answers, just more questions. It was clear the sheriff knew something, but wasn't ready to share. Back home, I looked up more stories about people going missing in desert areas near border towns. The stories were unsettling: disappearances, strange sightings, and rumors of dangerous encounters. The desert seemed to be a place where reality blurred with something darker. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint sound from outside. It was almost imperceptible, like a low hum or a distant engine. My heart raced as I looked out the window, but all I saw was the vast expanse of desert under the starlight. The sound faded, leaving me in a growing sense of dread. I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something was off, and I had to find out what. The next morning, I decided to return to the desert for one final search. I needed closure, whatever the cost. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I retraced my steps, hoping to uncover something I'd missed before. As I approached the area where the tire tracks had ended, a chill ran down my spine. The desert was as desolate as ever, but this time I wasn't alone. I felt eyes on me, though I saw no one. The realization hit me hard. Something, or someone, was out there watching. I returned to the desert one last time, driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation. The sun was starting to set as I parked my truck near the familiar trailhead. Shadows stretched long across the sand, and the cool evening air seemed to amplify the eerie stillness. I felt as though I was walking into a scene that had been set just for me, the environment oddly welcoming and threatening at the same time. As I trudged along the trail, I could see the area where the stranger had vanished. I scanned the ground for any sign of disturbance, any clue that could explain what happened. The tire tracks had long since been erased by the wind and sand, leaving no evidence of the man's last known location. The only thing that remained was the haunting feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite place. At the spot where we had last seen him, I noticed a small object half buried in the sand. It was a patch of worn leather, possibly from a jacket or a bag. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up, feeling a chill despite the warm air. I could barely make out a faded insignia, but it was enough to confirm that someone had been there recently. I tucked the patch into my pocket, hoping it might provide a lead. My flashlight flickered as darkness fell. I scanned the horizon, and that's when I noticed something peculiar, a dim light, moving erratically in the distance. I couldn't make out what it was, but the light seemed to be bouncing up and down like a signal or a beacon. It was too far to identify, but it was enough to make my nerves twitch. I decided to follow the light, feeling a sense of foreboding. As I approached, the light grew brighter, and I could hear faint sounds, distant chatter or voices, though they were too muffled to understand. I quickened my pace, eager to get closer. The light led me to an abandoned shack that seemed out of place, its structure barely standing against the elements. As I entered the shack, my flashlight revealed a scene that took my breath away. The interior was littered with abandoned personal items, clothes, old photographs, and what looked like a small journal. The journal was open to a page with crude drawings of desert trails and strange symbols. I flipped through it, feeling a growing sense of dread. The last entry was dated just a few days before my encounter with the stranger. It mentioned someone moving in the shadows and the search for a way out. Suddenly, a noise behind me made me spin around. There, standing in the doorway, was a man with a face I could barely recognize. His clothes were dusty and torn, and he had a wild look in his eyes. It was the same man from that night. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to leave before it's too late." I stumbled back, my mind racing. "Who are you? Why were you out there?" I demanded, but the man didn't answer. He turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a sense of imminent danger. I fled the shack, the journal clutched in my hand. The light I had followed was gone, and the desert was once again just an expanse of dark, empty space. The next morning, I went to the sheriff's office with the journal and the leather patch. The sheriff's face turned pale when he saw the items. He explained that a local meth lab had been discovered not far from the desert, and the area had been linked to several disappearances and drug-related violence. The man I had seen was likely a victim or a perpetrator, caught in a world far darker than I had imagined. The truth was more chilling than I had expected. The desert had always seemed so vast and empty, but now I knew it harbored dangers that went beyond the visible horizon. The man's warning echoed in my mind as I left the sheriff's office. I realized that sometimes what we think we understand about a place is only a fraction of the truth, and some mysteries, no matter how hard we search, remain buried in the shadows. It's been almost 13 months since Em died. I remember that day vividly. The collision that took her life was sudden and brutal. She was on her way home from work, and someone ran a red light. She was gone within minutes. We'd been together for 5 years, and though she didn't believe in marriage, I would have married her in a heartbeat if she had wanted it. M had this vibrant energy, a blend of boldness and tech savvy that made her unique. She loved camping but had this modern touch. She always smelled like cinnamon, a small but cherished detail that's become a haunting reminder of her absence. It started a few days after her death when I received the first strange message from her Facebook account. At first, I thought it was a prank. The message described what I was doing at that exact moment. I dismissed it as a cruel joke from someone who knew about her death. But then the messages kept coming, each one detailing my actions in ways that seemed impossible for anyone but M to know. I was alone when the first message came through, and the thought of someone watching me, knowing my every move, filled me with dread. In the beginning, the messages were vague but unsettling. They'd mentioned something minor, like the book I was reading or the TV show I was watching. I assumed it was a hacker who'd gained access to her account. I tried to reach out to Facebook support, but they brushed me off, saying there wasn't much they could do about compromised accounts. I memorialized M's page, hoping it would stop the messages, but they didn't stop. In fact, they became more specific. Tonight, something changed. The latest message was different, more disturbing. It described a private moment, something only I would know. I felt my pulse quicken as I read it. The message seemed to be taunting me, almost as if it was daring me to confront it. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone I knew? Someone who was playing a sick game with me? The idea that M's account could be sending these messages from beyond felt more real than I wanted to admit. As I stared at my phone, waiting for another notification, the tension in the room seemed to tighten. Every creak of the floorboards or flicker of the light made me jump. I thought about the last message, how it detailed a specific action I had just taken in my living room. The message ended with a question. "Are you scared yet?" It felt like a challenge, and I wasn't sure how much more I could handle. I need answers, but I don't know where to turn. I keep hoping that someone will explain this madness, but as the messages continue, I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. I'm left questioning whether it's possible that M could somehow still be reaching out to me through the digital void, or if there's a far more disturbing truth behind these messages. All I know is that I can't ignore it anymore. I tried to keep my mind occupied with other things, hoping the strange messages would fade into a bad memory. But each time I got a new notification from M's account, the fear and confusion would return with full force. Tonight, the tension is unbearable. My phone buzzed a few minutes ago, and I could hardly bring myself to check the screen. I know that the message will be unsettling, just like the last one. The message read, "I see you in the living room. You've been pacing back and forth for the past 5 minutes. Why are you so anxious?" My heart raced as I read those words. How could someone, even if they had access to her account, know such precise details about my actions? It felt like someone was watching me from somewhere I couldn't see. I glanced around the room, trying to find a source for my mounting unease, but the shadows danced playfully in the corners, mocking my attempt to find solace. I looked at her profile, the account that should have been a memorial. The page was untouched by the chaos of the messages, a stark contrast to the living, breathing nightmare of receiving them. It felt like a cruel joke, one that twisted the memory of M into something grotesque. I'm left with an agonizing decision. Should I delete her page and risk losing the last digital trace of her, or should I keep it and face this relentless torment? My mind raced as I tried to piece together any logical explanation. Could it be a sick prank by someone who knew about her? Or was there something more sinister at play? The thought of someone infiltrating her account felt increasingly plausible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more eerie was happening. My own reflection in the window seemed to mock my paranoia, every slight movement in the glass turning into a shadowy figure lurking just beyond. My phone buzzed again, this time with a new message that felt like a direct challenge. "You've been thinking about deleting my page, haven't you? How could you do that to me?" The words were a jab at my emotions, making me question my decisions. The thought of M's account watching and reacting to my thoughts was beyond unsettling. I feel trapped in a psychological maze with no way out. Every new message feeds my anxiety, making me question my own sanity. I need answers, but I'm afraid of what I might find. The thought of someone or something using M's account to manipulate me is terrifying. I've considered reaching out to the authorities, but what would I even say? My dead girlfriend's Facebook account is sending me disturbing messages. It sounds absurd, but it's my reality now. Each new message is a reminder of the unresolved pain and confusion I'm grappling with. I'm left wondering if deleting the page will finally bring me peace, or if it will only deepen the mystery. I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, but the fear never left. Each time I walked through the house, it felt like M was there, observing my every move. I began to notice the subtle changes around me, the way shadows seemed to shift, or how a breeze would rustle the curtains when there was no breeze. It was like the atmosphere itself was filled with her presence, and I couldn't escape it. That night, I decided to sit down and scroll through the messages from M's account, hoping to find a clue that would explain this madness. My fingers trembled as I tapped through each message, each one more disturbing than the last. One message caught my eye. I see you've been thinking about moving the picture frame in the hallway. It's been out of place for days. I'd been contemplating moving it, but I hadn't acted on it yet. How could she know? The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had hacked her account and was using it to mess with me. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. The detail in the messages was too precise, too personal. I felt a chill as I realized that these messages were more than just a prank. They were a cruel reflection of my own fears and insecurities. My mind was racing. I needed to take action. But what? My only idea was to confront the situation directly. I decided to send a message back. I typed, "If this is really you, M, please give me a sign. Anything that only you would know." I hit send, my heart pounding as I waited for a reply. Every second felt like an eternity. The response came almost instantly. "You still keep the key to the old box in the drawer by the bed. Why haven't you opened it?" The mention of the box sent me spiraling. I hadn't touched it since M's death. It was a small wooden box she kept her old letters and trinkets in, things she'd collected over the years. It was as if the message was pulling me towards it, forcing me to confront something I had long buried. I walked to the bedroom, my steps heavy with dread. The drawer was exactly where I remembered it, the key sitting on top, waiting. With shaking hands, I unlocked the box. Inside, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Old letters, a few photographs, and a small silver locket. But as I picked up the locket, a slip of paper fell out. It was a note I had never seen before, written in M's handwriting. It read, "You always were afraid of the dark." My breathing quickened. The note was a final, chilling reminder of how well she knew me. I felt a wave of despair and confusion. What was happening? Was this really M reaching out, or was someone playing an incredibly twisted game? I needed answers, but the more I uncovered, the less I felt I understood anything. All I knew was that I was no longer alone in this house, and the darkness that had always been a small part of me seemed to be closing in. The nights had become increasingly unbearable. Every sound, every creak of the house felt amplified, as if it was conspiring with the darkness. I had hoped that finding the locket and the note would bring some clarity, but it only added to my confusion. I kept thinking about that note. "You always were afraid of the dark." It struck a nerve deeper than I expected. As I lay in bed, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The house seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Shadows moved along the walls, shapes that seemed to flicker just beyond my line of sight. I would catch a glimpse of something and turn around, but find nothing there. It was maddening. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but the unease was so palpable, it felt almost tangible. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. I jolted awake and grabbed it. Another message from M's account. "You've been avoiding the attic lately. Why?" The message was sent just moments ago. I hadn't mentioned the attic to anyone. The attic had been neglected for years, filled with old boxes and cobwebs. The idea of going up there had always made me uneasy, but I had pushed those feelings aside, thinking it was just my imagination. I hesitated, but something about the message made me feel like I had to face it. I walked slowly to the attic door, each step echoing in the quiet house. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended. The air was musty, and I could barely see in the dim light. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The attic was a jumble of old furniture and dusty boxes, just as I remembered. I rummaged through the boxes, each one filled with old clothes, forgotten toys, and stacks of old newspapers. Nothing seemed out of place until I found an old trunk buried in the corner. It was locked. I pulled the key from my pocket and fumbled with it, the cold metal feeling heavy in my hand. As the trunk creaked open, I was met with an overwhelming odor of decay. Inside, there was a collection of old photographs, letters, and what looked like a diary. I picked up the diary. The cover was worn, and it felt oddly heavy in my hands. Flipping through the pages, I found entries that seemed like they were written by M. But something was off. The handwriting was familiar but slightly different, and the details were disturbingly precise. Details about my daily life that only someone who had been watching me would know. My heart raced. Was this some sick joke or something far more sinister? The final entry caught my eye. I'm waiting in the place you fear the most. It was dated just a few days before I received the first message. I closed the diary and sat back, trying to make sense of it all. The feeling of dread was overwhelming. Was it truly M trying to communicate, or was someone manipulating her memory to torment me? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was happening was far from over. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every creak of the house, every shadow, felt charged with malevolence. I needed answers, but the more I uncovered, the more I felt like I was sinking into a dark abyss with no way out. The messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. I had no idea what was real anymore and what was just a figment of my imagination. But I knew one thing: I couldn't escape this. The diary sat on my kitchen table, its presence almost as oppressive as the messages I had been receiving. The entries were hauntingly accurate, describing moments from my day with unsettling precision. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was behind this had been watching me for a long time. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I glanced at my phone. There was a new message notification. I took a deep breath and opened the message. It was a photo of my living room, taken from the angle of the armchair where I sat every evening. The caption read, "I see you're still sitting there, lost in thought." I felt my pulse quicken. I had been sitting in that chair just moments ago, lost in a spiral of despair and confusion. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, I decided to reach out to a friend from the old days. His name was Dan, and he had always been skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained. I dialed his number, my hands trembling. "Dan, I need your help," I said as soon as he picked up. "Hey, slow down. What's going on?" Dan's voice was calm, but I could sense his concern. "I'm getting messages from M's Facebook account. She's been dead for almost 13 months. These messages describe things I'm doing in real time. I don't know what to do." I felt my voice break, but I pressed on. "I found a diary in the attic, and it's like she's been keeping tabs on me." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure it's not someone messing with you? Maybe someone hacked her account." "I thought of that," I said, "but the details in the diary, the messages, they're too precise. It's like she's still here." Dan agreed to come over. As I waited, the house seemed to close in on me. Every corner held a shadow, every sound felt amplified. When Dan arrived, he took a quick look around. "Okay, let's see this diary." We went through the pages together. Dan's face grew more serious with each entry he read. "This is freaky," he said, "but we need to figure out if there's a rational explanation before jumping to conclusions." Dan decided to check the Facebook account for any clues. He found nothing out of the ordinary. No new logins, no suspicious activity. Everything seemed normal, but the messages kept coming. "Whoever's doing this knows a lot about you," Dan said, looking up from the screen. "They're playing a very sick game." I agreed, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that the messages were more than just a prank. Dan offered to stay the night, hoping that having someone there might ease the tension. We set up a makeshift bed for him in the living room and tried to relax. Just as we were about to head to bed, another message arrived. This time, it was a video. I hesitated but clicked play. The video was from inside my house, showing Dan and me from the doorway. It was recorded just minutes before. The caption read, "You thought you could hide? I'm closer than you think." Dan's face turned pale as he watched the video. We both knew something was very wrong. I tried to convince myself it was an elaborate prank, but the fear gnawing at my insides told me otherwise. I didn't understand how this could be happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to find out who was behind this before things got worse. The night was long and filled with unease. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light seemed charged with menace. We stayed alert, hoping for a clue, but the messages continued, each one more disturbing than the last. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't going to end until I uncovered the truth. It's been 3 years since Mom passed away, 8 days before my son was born. The house where she lived still feels like a shadow over everything. Dad still lives there, but I haven't been back. It's not just because of the logistics, though the ferry ride to reach the remote village is a hassle. There's a mental block, too. I can't bring myself to visit that place. It's become a personal battleground, a place I'm afraid to confront. I've kept my son away from that part of my life. I haven't shown him photos of the house or even mentioned it. The only link he has to that place is the framed photo of Mom hanging in our living room. It's strange, but he recognizes her as Grandma. It's been our only connection to her since she died. Last week, while showing him how to use Google Maps on my tablet, I thought it would be fun to explore our neighborhood and nearby landmarks. We scanned our house, his school, and even the other grandmother's house. I wanted him to understand the world a little better, even if it was just through a screen. Then, on a whim, I decided to check the rural village where Dad lives. I hadn't seen the Street View car pass through there before, so I was surprised to find that it had been updated recently. The house came into view. It was strange to see it again, even if only digitally. I hesitated, then started moving the view around. "Look, this is Grandma's house," my son suddenly shouted. His reaction was immediate and sure. I felt a chill. I hadn't mentioned anything about that house. "How do you know?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Because it was," he replied simply. My heart raced as I tried to play it cool. I asked him to point out different rooms. He did it without hesitation, identifying the kitchen, the room where Dad sleeps, everything exactly as it was in the photos. When I asked him to point out Grandma's room, he touched a specific spot on the screen and said, "It was that one." A shiver ran through me. How could he know this? I hadn't shown him any pictures of the house, and he had never been there. It was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. I was left with an unnerving question. How much of the past was seeping into the present? That moment with my son was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to laugh it off, but inside I felt a gnawing unease. His recognition of the house was so precise. I couldn't understand how he could know any of it. I dismissed it as a strange coincidence and moved on, but the doubt lingered. Later that evening, after putting my son to bed, I sat in the dim light of the living room, replaying the day's events. I could see his little finger pointing at the screen, touching the exact spot where Grandma's room used to be. My mind raced with questions. How could he have known? Was it just a child's imagination, or was there something more to it? I decided to check the photos I had of the house, pictures taken before Mom passed away. I went through them meticulously, comparing each room with the Street View image. The details matched. Everything was exactly as it should be. I felt a cold sense of disorientation. How could my son know so much about a place he had never seen? The thought of returning to that house, the house where Mom had lived and died, made my palms sweat. The idea of facing it was overwhelming. I hadn't stepped foot there since the day we buried her. The emotional distance I maintained was supposed to be my shield, but now it felt like it was closing in on me. I decided to call Dad, hoping to find some rational explanation. As I dialed his number, I could hear the unfamiliar thrum of worry in my voice. "Dad," I said when he answered, "do you know if any work has been done on the house? Any changes or renovations?" His response was slow. "Not that I'm aware of. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then asked, Did you notice anything odd about the house? Anything different from before? Dad's voice carried a tinge of curiosity. Not really. The place is pretty much the same. I thanked him and hung up, feeling no closer to understanding what was happening. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My son's words echoed in my mind. It was that one. The more I thought about it, the more I questioned reality itself. Was there a connection I was missing? Was it possible my son had tapped into something I had closed off? As the darkness of the room deepened, the uncertainty gnawed at me, leaving me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the house's old photos again. The images were scattered across the kitchen table, each one showing a different room. My hands shook slightly as I tried to match them with the street view picture. I wanted to convince myself that this was just a trick of the mind, that there was no deeper meaning to my son's reaction. It was a Sunday, and the sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over everything. Yet, despite the bright light, I felt a chill. I had spent the entire night tossing and turning, trying to piece together a rational explanation. My son's words kept repeating in my head. It was that one. My husband walked in and noticed my disheveled appearance. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of concern. I tried to sound nonchalant. "Just a little worried about something. I think I need to go to France soon," I said, avoiding eye contact. He looked puzzled. "France? Is there something wrong with the house?" I shook my head. "No, it's nothing really. Just something my son said." His eyes narrowed, sensing that there was more. "What did he say?" I could see he was struggling to keep his curiosity in check. I sighed. He recognized the house on Google Maps, said things that he shouldn't have known. He gave me a look that said he didn't quite believe me, but chose not to press further. "If you need to go, then go. Just make sure you're okay." I nodded and thanked him. The way he walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts, did nothing to ease the growing knot in my stomach. Later that day, I found myself scrolling through the Google Maps images again. I zoomed in on the house, tracing the outlines of each window, each door. The house looked eerily familiar, yet foreign in the digital format. The more I examined it, the more uneasy I felt. There was something unsettling about seeing it this way, like I was peering into a part of my life that was meant to remain hidden. As evening approached, I decided to call Dad again. I needed more information, anything that could shed light on this disturbing experience. I could almost feel the weight of my own questions as I dialed his number. "Dad, do you remember if Mom ever mentioned anything unusual about the house? Anything out of the ordinary?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Not really. Your mother was always very private about her things. Why are you asking about this now?" His voice carried a hint of irritation. I tried to explain, but the more I talked, the more I realized how absurd it all sounded. "It's just something my son said. It's probably nothing." After the call, I felt a sense of resignation. The day had dragged on with an unsettling slowness. I glanced at the house photo again, and my son's words came back to me with renewed intensity. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The house, with all its memories and secrets, was calling me back. The question was, what would I find when I finally returned? The following week, I found myself on a ferry, crossing the waters toward the small village where my father still lived. The anticipation weighed heavily on me, each minute dragging longer than the last. I stared out the window, watching the shoreline approach, my mind a whirlwind of uneasy thoughts. The weather was unremarkable, the gray skies mirroring my mood. I kept replaying my son's words in my head. It was that one. The familiarity in his voice was unsettling. When I finally arrived at my father's house, the place seemed unchanged. The same ivy crept up the old stone walls, and the scent of musty air greeted me as I opened the door. My father was waiting inside, his face lighting up with a mix of joy and relief. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, embracing me. I tried to smile, but it felt stiff, out of place. "It's been a while. I needed to see the house again." The house seemed to hold its breath as we walked through the rooms. Everything was as I remembered. Yet there was an almost oppressive stillness that made my skin prickle. My father chatted about mundane things, garden updates, neighborhood news, but I barely heard him. My thoughts were consumed by the house's layout, trying to match it with the image on Google Maps and the strange familiarity my son had shown. As evening approached, I decided to explore the house alone. I needed to understand why my son's recognition of the place felt so eerie. I wandered through the rooms, each one evoking a different memory. The old armchair in the living room, where my mother used to sit, the worn rug with the faded patterns, all of it seemed like a scene from a forgotten dream. The more I looked around, the more I felt the weight of every unanswered question pressing down on me. In the attic, I stumbled upon a box of old photographs and letters. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The musty smell of aged paper filled the air as I sifted through the contents. Among the letters, I found a small, intricately folded note with my mother's handwriting. The words were almost too faint to read, but one line caught my eye. "I have a feeling they'll come to know the truth." Confused and a little frightened, I carried the note downstairs to show my father. He looked at it, his face turning pale. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tight. "In the attic," I replied. "Why? What's wrong?" He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "There are things about this house that you don't know. Your mother, she had her reasons for being so secretive." His eyes avoided mine, looking distant. "It's time you knew the full story." His words left me with a new, heavier dread. The house was not just a place of memories, but a repository of secrets I hadn't anticipated. As the night settled in, I felt a growing sense of unease. The house, with its familiar rooms and dusty corners, seemed to be hiding something that my son's innocent recognition had only scratched the surface of. What was the truth my mother had hinted at? And what other secrets were buried in the walls of this old house? As I sat in the dimly lit living room with the old note clutched in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My father had excused himself to the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the heavy air of the house. The shadows danced on the walls as the old grandfather clock ticked steadily, its sound growing louder in the silence. I could barely focus on the note's cryptic message, my mind racing with the implications of what my father had hinted. I decided to confront him. I found him in the kitchen, his back turned as he cleaned up. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "what did Mom mean? What truth was she referring to?" He paused, his shoulders tensing. He slowly turned around, his eyes meeting mine with a look of deep regret. "It's not something I wanted to revisit," he began, his voice heavy. "Your mother was always a private person, but there were things she kept hidden, even from me. There were incidents here, things that were never explained." He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I thought it was best to leave the past buried. The unease settled deeper in my chest. "Incidents? What kind of incidents?" I pressed. "Why didn't you tell me before?" He sighed, a deep, shuddering breath. "Years ago, there were reports of strange occurrences in the village. People talked about odd sounds coming from this house, objects moving on their own. Your mother never believed in such things, but she was always cautious. There were disturbances. I dismissed them as old wives' tales until one night." His voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Until what?" I asked urgently. "Until one night," he continued, "when I saw something I couldn't explain. I was alone here, working late. I heard footsteps in the attic, but when I went up, there was nothing. I found the attic door wide open, and a few days later, I discovered a hidden room behind the wall." He looked away, shivering slightly. "It was filled with old belongings, things that didn't belong to us." My heart pounded. "What kind of belongings?" I asked, leaning forward. "Old photographs," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Photos of people I didn't recognize, and some of them were—" He stopped abruptly, unable to finish the thought. The air seemed to tighten around us, the tension almost palpable. "Were what?" I asked, almost pleading. He swallowed hard, then spoke with a shudder. "Some of the photos were taken inside this house. One of them showed a woman who looked like your mother, but much younger, standing in front of the house. The date was long before we ever moved in." I stared at him, struggling to process his words. "What does this mean?" I asked. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "I didn't want to scare you," he said. "I thought it was just a coincidence, or maybe I was seeing things. But now, with what you've found, I don't know what to think. My mind raced with the possibilities. If the photographs were real, if they truly depicted my mother in a time before we even lived here, what did it mean? My son's strange recognition of the house suddenly seemed more ominous. The sense of dread intensified as I realized that the house might hold more than just old memories. In that moment, I felt a deep, unsettling connection between the house, my mother, and the unknown. There was a truth lurking in these walls, a truth that had been waiting for years to be uncovered. The old house, with its secrets and hidden rooms, had become a dark puzzle I had to solve. As the night deepened, I knew that the real horror was not just in the unsettling photographs or the strange occurrences. It was in the realization that the house seemed to be alive with a history that was intertwining with my own, revealing a past that I wasn't fully prepared to confront. When we moved into our new suburban home, it felt like a dream come true after years of financial strain. We had saved up for what felt like forever, and finally, the day came when we could leave behind our cramped apartment and step into this spacious house. The deal was sweetened by the fact that the house had been a model home. It had all these flashy, staged furnishings that were supposed to entice buyers. We got a hefty discount because of it, which made it even more appealing. The loft area was the centerpiece of the house. It had 2 staircases, one in the front and one in the back. From up there, you could hear almost everything happening below. It was meant to be open and airy, perfect for a family space. But something about it made me uneasy, even though I couldn't put my finger on why. The space felt strangely exposed, like it was too open for comfort. One Saturday afternoon, I invited my 2 best friends, Jake and Lily, over to hang out. We were all in high school and spent a lot of time together. The loft was our go-to spot for chilling out and watching TV. That day, Jake and Lily were unusually close, huddled together on the couch. I didn't think much of it until I decided to take a quick bathroom break. They seemed pretty absorbed in whatever was on the screen, their voices a low murmur as I left. When I came back, I noticed a shift. Jake and Lily were sitting on opposite sides of the couch, their faces uncharacteristically tense. I could tell something was off. "Hey, what happened?" I asked, trying to sound casual but feeling a knot forming in my stomach. Jake looked at me, his face pale. "We thought we heard your little sister up here," he said quietly. "She sounded like she was running up and down the stairs, hitting each step with her hands." My heart dropped. I knew my sister wasn't home, and the idea that she was somehow up there, playing around as if nothing was wrong, was unsettling. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though I already felt a chill running down my spine. We checked the house thoroughly. Every room was empty, and there was no sign of anyone else being there. I tried to reassure them, but my mind was racing. The sound of a child running up and down the stairs, the kind of noise you can't easily ignore, was not something I could easily dismiss. Jake and Lily were firm in their belief, and their unease was starting to seep into me. The open loft, once a symbol of our new beginning, now felt like it was hiding something from us. After that unsettling afternoon with Jake and Lily, things didn't exactly return to normal. The loft, which used to be a place of laughter and comfort, now felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards or echo from the open space seemed amplified, as if the house was holding its breath. I spent the following days trying to convince myself that Jake and Lily must have been mistaken. They were spooked by the house's open design and their own imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was meant to be our fresh start, but now it felt like a weight on my shoulders. One evening, after Jake and Lily had left, I decided to investigate further. I walked through the house alone, making sure to check every corner, every room. The loft was empty, as it always was. I stood in the center of the room, trying to imagine what they could have heard. The idea that a child's laughter could echo so clearly was disturbing. As I reached the staircase leading to the loft, I noticed the intercom system. It had been installed in every room, and we used it occasionally to talk to each other or play music. That night, I turned on the intercom, hoping to find some clue about the strange sounds Jake and Lily had described. I listened closely, but all I could hear was static, The static felt oppressive, as though it was trying to tell me something. I left the intercom on and went to bed, determined to see if anything would happen. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of the intercom button being pressed. I grabbed my phone, checked the intercom, and saw nothing but static. My heart raced as I wondered if someone was using it intentionally. The next morning, I told my parents about the strange noises and the intercom incident. They brushed it off as a technical glitch, but I wasn't convinced. I knew there was more to it. As days went by, the feeling of unease grew. I started noticing subtle things, shadows that seemed to move, a cold draft in the loft, and sometimes the feeling of being watched. My parents planned a weekend getaway, leaving me alone with the house. I dreaded the solitude, but couldn't shake the need to understand what was happening. I spent the evening exploring, trying to recreate the conditions under which Jake and Lily had heard the child's laughter. As I moved about, the sensation of being watched intensified. The loft, which once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a stage for something unseen, a space where past tragedies lingered and whispered through the empty air. That weekend alone, I tried to stay busy, doing everything I could to distract myself from the growing tension. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, rearranged furniture, and even tackled some DIY projects. Still, the feeling of unease clung to me like a second skin. It was as if the house was not just old, but alive, watching my every move. One night, while I was in the living room, I decided to recheck the intercom system. I had hoped that leaving it on might catch something, any hint of what was causing the disturbances. I sat on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows around the room. The static on the intercom filled the room with an almost imperceptible hum, and I found myself staring at it, waiting for something to happen. Then, a sound from the loft made me jump. It was a series of thumps, like someone running up the stairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I climbed the stairs slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. As I reached the top, the loft was quiet, nothing but the usual dim light filtering through the large windows. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I retraced my steps back downstairs, feeling like I was being pulled into the house's eerie rhythm. My skin crawled as I reached the bottom, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just out of sight. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew there was something more to it. The next day, I decided to investigate the history of the house. I visited the local library and combed through old newspapers and records. It turned out that the previous owners had left the house suddenly, and there were rumors about an accident involving a child. I found a brief mention of a little girl who had died falling from the loft. Her name was Sarah. I returned home with a sinking feeling. It all made sense now, the laughter, the running footsteps, and the unsettling static. I felt as if I had uncovered a truth that was meant to remain hidden. As night fell, I found myself drawn to the loft again. I sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by the dim light of a single lamp, waiting for something to happen. The static on the intercom was louder, almost as if it was breathing, waiting for me to understand. Just before I went to bed, the intercom crackled and the static abruptly stopped. I leaned closer, hoping for some sort of explanation. Instead, the sound of children's laughter, clear and unmistakable, came through the speaker. My heart raced as I turned it off and stumbled back, the sound still ringing in my ears. I could almost see Sarah's shadow darting across the loft, her laughter echoing in my mind. I realized then that I hadn't just moved into a new house. I had stepped into a living memory, a place where the past lingered and refused to be forgotten. The truth was more than unsettling. It was a part of the house's identity. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was still there, her presence an inescapable part of the house. After the discovery of Sarah's story, sleep became a distant memory. Each night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the feeling that something was watching me. I'd hear footsteps in the hall, but when I checked, the house remained empty. The intercom's static became a nightly companion, and I began to dread the evening hours. One particular night, I woke up to the sound of the intercom button being pressed. I checked my watch, 3 a.m., The house was still and quiet, except for the faint, eerie noise coming from the intercom. It was like someone was holding down the button, but not speaking. I trudged downstairs, every creak of the wooden steps amplifying my growing sense of dread. As I reached the base of the stairs, the static grew louder. I approached the intercom, the soft hum vibrating through my fingertips as I pressed the button to turn it off. The sound abruptly stopped. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the switch, my breath shallow. My gut told me that the worst was yet to come. With the intercom now silent, I noticed a faint light coming from the loft. It was a dull glow, barely perceptible. My heart raced as I climbed the stairs, the old wood groaning under my weight. The loft looked the same as always, empty, still and untouched. But the light, it seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I stood there, feeling the weight of the house's history pressing down on me. The memories of Sarah, the laughter, the thumps, everything felt so close, so real. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still up there, trapped in her final moments. I felt an overwhelming need to confront it, to understand what she wanted. I reached for the light switch, but my hand stopped midair. A cold breeze brushed past me, making the hairs on my neck stand up. I turned slowly, and there, in the corner of the loft, was a small, old-fashioned toy, one that I'd never seen before. It was a wooden horse, its paint chipped and worn. It seemed out of place, like a relic from another time. As I reached out to touch it, the laughter I'd heard on the intercom came back, louder and clearer. It was unmistakable now, a child's giggle echoing around the loft. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was only the empty room. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft thud. I glanced at the toy horse again. It had moved slightly, as if someone had nudged it. My hands shook as I backed away, my mind racing with possibilities. What did Sarah want from me? Why was she still here? As I fled back downstairs, I felt an icy chill run through me. I realized that Sarah wasn't just a story. She was a part of the house, an echo of the past that refused to fade. And now it seemed she was trying to reach out. I needed answers, but I was beginning to understand that uncovering them might be more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The nights grew increasingly unsettling. I tried to rationalize everything, convinced myself it was just the house settling, old pipes making odd noises. But deep down, I knew it was more. The intercom's static and the distant, eerie laughter had become a nightly ritual I dreaded. I began to feel like an intruder in my own home, haunted by a past I couldn't escape. One evening, my curiosity got the best of me. I decided to research the house's history in hopes of finding something to explain the unsettling events. I went through old newspapers and property records. I found some mentions of the house, but nothing unusual stood out, except one detail. The previous family had left abruptly, without any explanation. Their departure was so sudden, it almost seemed like they had fled. I couldn't shake the image of that toy horse from the loft. Why would it be there? I went back to the loft one night, determined to find some logical explanation. The loft was as I had left it, except the horse was gone. My heart pounded as I searched every corner. I found nothing, no trace of the toy or any other clues. Then, while scanning the floor, I noticed something, a faint outline where the toy horse had been. It was a small, square mark on the hardwood floor. I pressed my hand against it, feeling the smooth texture, then lifted a floorboard nearby. Underneath, I discovered an old box, dusty and covered in cobwebs. Inside were a few personal items, a girl's diary, a small bracelet, and a photograph of a family. I opened the diary. The pages were filled with childish handwriting, detailing everyday events and drawings of a little girl. As I read through it, I found entries about her fear of falling, her concerns about the scary man, and her love for the toy horse that had been found in the loft. It was as if she had known something was wrong, something beyond the ordinary. A sudden sound interrupted my reading, a soft, childish giggle. I jumped, heart racing, and looked around the empty loft. The noise came from the intercom again, its static filling the room. I could feel the panic rising. I couldn't deny it any longer. Whatever was happening in the house was connected to that little girl. In a desperate attempt to understand, I called a local historian who specialized in old homes. After some probing, she revealed that the girl's death wasn't just an accident. The previous family had been involved in a tragic event that left the house with a dark reputation. They had tried to move on, but the house seemed to hold on to its past. With this new information, everything fell into place. The static, the laughter, the toy horse, they were all remnants of a past that hadn't been fully resolved. The house was holding on to its history, unwilling to let go. I realized that the little girl's spirit might not be seeking revenge, but was simply trapped, trying to reach out. The final twist came that night. As I lay in bed, the intercom buzzed again. This time, it wasn't static. It was the sound of a child's voice calling my name. I rushed to the loft, hoping to find some explanation. But there, lying on the floor, was the toy horse, just as it had been before. I picked it up, feeling a strange warmth in my hands. The house had its secrets, and it seemed that understanding them was the only way to find peace, both for myself and for the lingering spirit of the little girl. The hotel room was barely big enough for the two of us. Mom and I had taken the trip as a break from the stress that had been hanging over us for months. We'd picked this hotel for its charm, but the room was unremarkable. Just a standard setup with a small bed, a few mismatched chairs, and a window that faced a brick wall. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a way to unwind after a tough stretch. But what happened that night turned it into something I still can't explain. I remember lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. My eyes were heavy, and I was on the edge of sleep when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the room's darkness, stood about 2 meters from my bed. It looked like a human figure, though it was indistinct and lacked detail. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, something that would vanish when I blinked. But it didn't. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Shadows do strange things in low light, right? Still, a chill crept up my spine. I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp, and the silhouette vanished immediately. I exhaled in relief, but the comfort was fleeting. When I turned the light back off, the shadow was there again, just as it had been before. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stared at the shadow. The room was empty of objects that could cast such a shape. I got up and walked around, checking every corner. Nothing. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed since I'd last checked. I was alone in the room, just me, the shadow, and the creeping fear that was making my heart pound. Returning to bed, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I faced away from where I'd seen the shadow, trying to focus on anything other than the dark corner. I didn't want to turn my head, didn't want to see if it was still there. The darkness seemed to press in on me, and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that by ignoring it, it would go away. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep, plagued by uneasy dreams. The next morning, I told Mom about what happened. I expected her to brush it off as a figment of my imagination, but her reaction was far from dismissive. She merely shrugged and said, "It was probably just your imagination." I felt a pang of frustration, but I let it slide, thinking maybe I had been more tired than I realized. After all, the shadow didn't reappear that night or the next. It was as if it had vanished with the morning light, leaving me with nothing but questions and a lingering sense of unease. A few days after we got back home, the shadow in the hotel room had already started to feel like a distant memory. Life went back to its normal routine. I tried to put the whole thing behind me. However, something happened that brought the shadow back to the forefront of my mind. I was sitting at the kitchen table, studying for an upcoming exam. Mom was bustling around the kitchen, making lunch. I was so focused on my notes that I barely noticed her moving about. It was a typical afternoon, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only background noise. Out of nowhere, Mom said, "Do you remember that shadow you saw at the hotel?" Her voice was casual, but I sensed a weight behind her words. I looked up from my notes, surprised by the sudden mention of it. "Yeah, I remember. Why?" Her gaze remained fixed on the sink as she said, "I saw it too." Her tone was calm, but there was something unsettling in her words. My heart raced as the reality of what she said sank in. I wasn't the only one who had seen that silhouette. I had been so sure I had imagined it that maybe it was just a trick of the light or exhaustion. But now, hearing that she saw it too, made me question everything. Mom continued with her chores, seemingly nonchalant, but I could tell she was holding back. "Why didn't you say anything before?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me with a tired expression and said, "I didn't want to scare you. I thought maybe it was just a fluke, something we both saw because we were stressed or something." Her words didn't make the situation any less eerie. The fact that she had kept it from me was unsettling. If she had seen the same thing, it meant it wasn't just my imagination. We had both witnessed something unexplainable, and it was now a shared experience. I tried to piece together what we might have seen, but the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Mom then told me that she had been dealing with a lot of grief. A close friend had passed away recently, and she had spent hours writing a letter to find some closure. She mentioned that the friend had been struggling before her death. I couldn't help but wonder if the shadow was somehow connected to this. Had the shadow been a final message, a lingering presence from her friend trying to reach out? The idea was both haunting and strangely comforting. The more I dwelled on it, the more the shadow seemed to take on a new meaning. It wasn't just a strange occurrence in a hotel room. It felt like it was part of something deeper. I tried to focus on my studies, but the unsettling feeling lingered. The shadow had moved from a simple scare to something far more personal and troubling, leaving me with more questions than answers. The days dragged on, and the shadow from the hotel had become a dark thought I couldn't shake. My mind was preoccupied with the strange encounter, and though I tried to focus on school and daily activities, the unease lingered. Every now and then, the image of that shadow would creep back into my thoughts, making me question everything I knew about reality. One evening, I was alone in my room, trying to study. The soft hum of my desk lamp was the only sound in the room. I was deeply absorbed in my textbook when a sudden noise from the hallway made me jump. It was just a creak, likely from the house settling. Yet, the noise had pulled me out of my focus, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Trying to clear my head, I stood up and went to the kitchen to get some water. As I walked past my mom's room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A sliver of light from the hallway illuminated the darkened room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. My mom was at her desk, surrounded by papers and pens. She was writing furiously, her face etched with concentration. "Hey, Mom," I said softly, not wanting to interrupt her too abruptly. She looked up, her eyes tired but focused. "What are you working on?" She paused, hesitating before answering. "Just trying to finish that letter I was working on. I feel like there's still more to say." Her response was casual, but there was a hint of something unresolved in her voice. The intensity of her focus was clear, and I wondered if the letter was consuming her thoughts as much as the shadow was consuming mine. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the memory of the shadow came rushing back. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, the outline of the shadow would reappear, as if etched into the darkness behind my eyelids. I couldn't ignore the connection between the shadow and my mom's grief. Had her friend's presence somehow followed us from the hotel? Was the shadow linked to the letter she was writing, a message that hadn't found its way to her yet? My thoughts were a tangled mess, each possibility more unsettling than the last. The next day, I decided to confront Mom about my growing fears. We sat down for coffee, and I brought up the topic carefully. "Mom, do you think there's any chance the shadow we saw was trying to communicate something?" I watched her reaction closely, searching for any signs that she might know more than she let on. Mom looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "It's hard to say," she said slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about what I wrote in that letter. Maybe it's a way of finding closure, or maybe it's just my mind playing tricks. I don't really know." Her uncertainty mirrored my own, adding another layer to the puzzle. As I pondered her response, the unease in my chest grew. The connection between the shadow and Mom's letter was becoming more apparent, but it still didn't make sense. The shadow was a lingering presence, an enigma that seemed to defy simple explanations. I felt trapped in a cycle of doubt and fear. unable to escape the lingering sense that something far beyond our understanding was at play. The days after that conversation with Mom were a blur. I found myself constantly thinking about the shadow and how it seemed so closely tied to what my mom had been working on. The idea that it might have been linked to her late friend weighed heavily on me. I was caught between skepticism and an uneasy feeling that something more was going on. One evening, I was alone in the house while Mom went out for groceries. I used the quiet time to clean my room. The more I cleaned, the more my thoughts drifted back to the shadow. I couldn't shake the image of it from that hotel room. I started to wonder if there was something I missed, some clue that could explain the shadow's appearance. I began rummaging through some old boxes, searching for anything that might connect to the hotel or that strange night. As I dug through the dusty items, I found an old photo album. Flipping through it, I came across pictures of Mom with her friend, smiling and carefree. The photos seemed to tell a story of a deep bond that was abruptly cut short. My heart ached for Mom, who had lost someone so dear. As the evening grew darker, the house took on a different atmosphere. Shadows from the streetlights outside danced on the walls, their movements oddly reminiscent of that night. My mind raced as I thought about how the shadow had reappeared every time I tried to ignore it. Was there something in that room that I had missed? Mom returned later, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Hey, I was thinking about what we discussed the other day," I started, trying to sound casual. "Do you remember if your friend had any specific habits or signs she used to show up in dreams?" Mom looked up, puzzled. "I don't know if she had any habits like that, but she was always so full of life, and I can't help but think she might have left something unfinished." Her words left a knot in my stomach. What if her friend had indeed left something unfinished? What if that shadow was an echo of something unresolved? I couldn't stop myself from feeling that we had somehow invited this presence into our lives. That night, sleep eluded me. I kept replaying the events from the hotel in my mind, trying to make sense of them. The shadow's shape seemed to have a will of its own, and the more I thought about it, the more its presence felt like a message waiting to be understood. In the dead of night, I found myself getting up and walking toward the old box I had left open. My fingers traced the edges of the photo album. As I flipped through the pages again, a sudden thought struck me. What if the shadow was a way for Mom's friend to communicate, a sign she wanted to share something important? I felt a chill run down my spine. The idea that the shadow might be a part of something deeper, something beyond our understanding, left me feeling both frightened and compelled to uncover the truth. The days following that night became a series of restless moments. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light, felt like it was taunting me, reminding me of the shadow and the unsettling conversation with Mom. My nights were plagued by dreams of that silhouette, each dream more vivid and disturbing than the last. I tried to focus on my schoolwork, but my mind kept drifting back to the hotel and the shadow. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, going over my notes. The clock on the wall ticked away steadily, a constant reminder of the passage of time. I glanced at the old photo album, which I had left open on the counter. The faces in the photos seemed to follow me with their eyes, their smiles now feeling like a haunting presence rather than memories of happier times. Mom came in from the garage, her face showing the signs of a long day. She put down her keys and sat across from me. "I've been thinking more about that night," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I went through some old letters and journals of my friend. She always had this strange habit of writing things down when she was feeling unsettled." I leaned in, intrigued. "What did she write about?" Mom hesitated, then continued. "There was one entry that caught my attention. She mentioned feeling like something was watching her, something that she couldn't quite understand. It was as if she knew she was being followed, but she couldn't see who or what it was." The room felt colder as her words sank in. I couldn't help but connect this to the shadow I had seen. What if it wasn't just a shadow, but something linked to the distress that Mom's friend had experienced before she died? The thought was chilling, but I had to know more. Later that night, while Mom was asleep, I decided to revisit the hotel in my mind. I sat in my room, the light from the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I replayed every detail of that night, trying to pinpoint something I might have missed. That's when it hit me. The shadow had never moved. It remained in the same spot, perfectly still, as if it was waiting for something. I grabbed the photo album and flipped through the pages once more. In one of the pictures, there was a group photo of Mom and her friend, taken in front of a hotel similar to the one we stayed at. My eyes fixed on the background, and that's when I saw it, an eerie resemblance to the shape of the shadow. I felt a cold sweat on my brow. The realization hit me like a punch. The shadow wasn't just a random phenomenon. It was somehow connected to Mom's friend's final moments, perhaps even trying to communicate. When Mom woke up the next morning, I had to confront her. "Mom, I think I figured something out," I said, barely containing my anxiety. "The shadow wasn't just a shadow. It might be connected to your friend's final days. I saw something in the photo album that made me think." Mom's face went pale. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. I showed her the photo, pointing out the background. "The hotel in the picture looks just like the one we stayed in. I think the shadow was a sign, maybe a way for her to communicate something important." Mom's eyes welled up. I didn't want to believe it, but I've been thinking the same thing. Maybe she was trying to reach out to me for some closure. I've been so focused on my grief that I didn't see it clearly. The revelation left us both shaken. The shadow might have been an attempt to say goodbye or convey a message. We realized that the encounter wasn't just about fear. It was a reminder of unresolved feelings and the connections we hold with those we've lost. As unsettling as it was, it gave us both a sense of closure, knowing that Mom's friend might have found a way to make peace.